A ridge of limestone, a curtain of falling snow. The Wyoming Territory, October of 1885, 17 degrees before dawn. The road at the base of the cliff runs empty for 90 miles east. A wagon track cuts across it, then a paddock fence, then the low pine roof of a homestead where a single window burns yellow against the black. Inside, a woman kneels at a stove, her hands raw at the knuckles feed kindling into the ash. She pours coffee into 2 tin cups. She pauses at the doorway of the bedroom. She does not go in. On the porch outside, boot heels strike the plank. A man in oiled going-to-town boots. A woman beside him in a fur-collared traveling coat that has never known this cold. Behind them, a badge catches the porch light. The kitchen door opens. The 2 tin cups touch the porch rail. She looks at the sheriff first. The paper in the county recorder's office was 17 years old by the time Willa Ashwood learned what it truly said, and by then the ink had already outlived her father, her mother, her unborn son, and every soft assumption she had ever made about the word home. It sat in a locked drawer in Cheyenne, folded twice, signed, once stamped with the dry red seal of the Wyoming Territorial Land Office. She would not see it with her own eyes until spring. But on the morning of October 14th, 1885, the paper began its slow work of ruining her life, and the first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a temperature 17 degrees cold enough to crack a rain barrel down its seam, cold enough to make the breath of a man on a porch look like the ghost of his own worst self. She had been up since 4. That was the shape of every day she had spent under the low pine roof of the Ackerley homestead for 3 winters, 3 springs, 3 unfinished summers. She rose in the dark because her father had risen in the dark, because her mother had risen in the dark, because the milk cow needed hand-warm fingers on frozen teats, because the stove needed coaxing back from its bed of gray ash. On this particular morning, she had already fed the chickens, split kindling with a hatchet she had sharpened herself 2 nights before, put a pot of coffee on to boil before she noticed that Judd Ackerley's boots by the door were not the muddy work boots he wore to move cattle. They were his going-to-town boots, oiled, buffed with a rag she had washed on the previous Sunday. She looked at those boots for a long moment. Then she looked at the door. Then she went to the stove, poured the coffee into 2 tin cups, carried them toward the bedroom. Because she had learned in 3 years that a man who oils his boots at first light is a man about to tell you something you will not want to hear standing up. He was not in the bedroom. He was on the porch. He was not alone. The woman beside Judd was a picture of another country. Fur collar the color of poured cream. Kid gloves. A traveling hat pinned so precisely at the temple that the wind rocking the cottonwoods could not shift it a quarter inch. She was perhaps 24, with the kind of skin that had never known a Wyoming January, holding a small carpet bag against her hip, as if she had only just stepped down from a train and expected the porch to know her. Behind them, hitched to the fence rail, stood a matched pair of dark bay horses in fresh harness. Behind those horses, with his hat in his hands like a man attending a funeral no one wanted to name, was Sheriff Amos Redding. Willa did not drop the cups. She would think about that later in the cave, when she cataloged the small dignities she had held on to that day. She set the cups down carefully on the porch rail. She looked at the sheriff first because the sheriff was the one whose face told her the shape of the trouble. Amos Redding was a man who had known her father in the last year of the Union Pacific survey work near Green River, who had watched her carry her mother's medicine bag into 3 separate cabins during the diphtheria week of 1883, who had once refused payment for delivering a message from Cheyenne because he said it was the least a man could do for a woman who had sewn up his deputy's forearm on a kitchen table. His face this morning was the face of a man being asked to do the least any man should ever have to do, being paid to do it anyway. His hand did not leave the buckle of his gun belt. His breath came out in a slow plume that broke apart against the porch post before it reached her. Judd spoke first. She would remember that too. Not the woman, not the sheriff, but Judd, who had held her through the long February night after their son was born too early and did not draw a single breath. Judd, who had said into her hair that he would carry her sorrow for both of them until the mountain grew flat. Judd, who now stood on the porch of the house she had made livable and used the word arrangement. Our arrangement, he called it, as if the 3 years had been a lease on a mule. He explained in the flat, measured voice of a man reading from a paper he had rehearsed that Cordelia Whitfield of Denver had done him the honor of accepting his proposal of marriage, that the wedding would take place at Christmas in her father's parlor, that she would need a house not currently occupied by a woman whose name did not appear on any document of importance. He said that he was sorry. He said that the sheriff had come along to make sure the transition was orderly. He said that she had 30 minutes to gather her personal effects, that personal effects meant clothing purchased before her arrival at the ranch correspondence bearing her name, nothing else. He did not look at her when he said any of it. He looked at a point somewhere above her left ear at the pine board he had asked her to help him nail into place the previous August. Cordelia Whitfield smiled at her. It was not a cruel smile. It was worse. It was the smile of a woman greeting a housekeeper she had inherited, along with the wallpaper warm in the way that expected no answer. Willa's chest did a thing she had not felt since her mother's last hour, a slow contraction that had no sound. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say the name of their son, the name they had chosen, and never spoken aloud to anyone else, the name she had scratched with a knitting needle into the inside board of the cradle before they buried the cradle in the ash tree grove. She wanted to say to the sheriff that she had stitched the very shirt Judd was wearing under his coat, that the coffee she had just poured into the tin cups had come from beans she had traded for by mending Hattie Boone's tablecloths for 3 consecutive Sundays. She wanted to say a great many things. Instead, she said only in a voice that surprised her by remaining. Even that 30 minutes was a generous allowance for a woman who owned nothing before she went inside to gather what was hers. She had in truth very little. A wooden trunk the size of a bread box painted once worn back to bare pine by 3 summers of open windows. Inside it, her father's compass, in a velvet-lined case with the velvet gone brown at the edges. A pewter thimble her mother had used on the diphtheria week to hold whiskey for cleaning wounds. A folded packet of paper wrapped in oilcloth containing her mother's herbal receipts, written in a slanting schoolhouse hand, some in ink, some in pencil where the ink had run out on a long night. A photograph of her father as a young man kept in a tin frame the size of her palm. A pocket knife with a bone handle. A tin box of sulfur-tipped matches. A Colt peacemaker that had belonged to her father unloaded wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. 6 cartridges. A small leather-bound copy of her mother's favorite psalms, the binding split. She laid these things in the trunk with the slow economy of a woman who had been packing herself into small boxes since she was 10 years old. The clothing she considered separately. She owned 2 work dresses of gray linsey woolsey, 1 Sunday dress of dark blue calico she had never worn on a Sunday because there had never been a Sunday for it. She owned 2 pairs of wool stockings, a chemise, a set of long johns that had been her father's, a broad-brimmed hat with a chin cord. Everything else she was wearing, flannel shirt, canvas, work trousers, cut for a boy that she had bought 2-hand from a widow in town, a leather belt, a pair of stout work boots with the heels worn down to the shanks. All of this she folded stacked into a burlap sack. There was one more thing she wanted, one thing that would test whether Judd Ackerley had any measurable soul left to weigh. The sheepskin coat hung on the peg by the door. She had made it the previous winter from 3 fleeces she had bartered off a rancher named Hollins in exchange for stitching up his daughter's cheek after a horse kick. She had cured the hides herself in the shed, worked the wool with a comb of her own making, sewn the seams by lamplight over 4 nights, that had cost her the vision in her right eye for a week after. Judd had watched her make it. Judd had watched her hem it. Judd had, on the coldest day of last January, wrapped himself in it while she sat wrapped in a wool blanket by the stove and called her clever. She reached for it now. His hand closed on the collar before hers did. His voice, when it came, was not angry. It was almost apologetic, which made it much worse. That coat, he told her, had been bought with his money. She had made it, yes, but the wool had come from his ranch. The ranch was his, the wool was his, therefore the coat was his. He said this in the same measured tone he had used to describe the wedding. Cordelia would find a use for it, he added. So she thought for a moment that he meant Cordelia would wear it. Then she understood he meant Cordelia would give it to a hired hand. She let go of the collar. She would not fight for wool in front of Amos Redding. She picked up the trunk in one arm, slung the burlap sack over the other shoulder, walked out onto the porch past Cordelia Whitfield. Without turning her head, carried her things to the fence rail where Barnaby, the old mule, stood waiting, because Barnaby had always stood waiting. Ever since the day she had bought him for $3 plus a Sunday dinner from a freighter who had been ready to shoot him for the sin of being old. The oak door closed behind her. She heard the bar drop. She had cut the wood for that bar herself back in the second week when Judd had complained that the old one was warped. She had planned it smooth on the back porch while he watched from the kitchen window and drank a beer from a stone jar. The sound of it dropping into the brackets now was the sound of a lock she had made being turned against her. Sheriff Redding walked her to the mule. He did not speak until she had tied the trunk to the pack saddle with the double diamond hitch her father had taught her when she was 9. Then he cleared his throat the way a man clears his throat before a hard word, telling her very quietly that he had known this was coming for 3 weeks. That Judd had ridden into Cheyenne in September, paid a lawyer named Prendergast to draw up documents. That Redding himself had signed nothing. Would sign nothing, but the deed to the homestead was clean in Judd's name, and had been since 1882, 3 months before she had first ridden up the wagon road on Barnaby's back with her burlap sack, her father's compass, her mother's psalms. He said without meeting her eyes that she should go to Hattie Boone, that Hattie would know what to do, that there were things a sheriff could not say in the doorway of a house he did not own, that he was sorry that he would not sleep well that night, that he hoped she would not judge him by the shape of a badge he had not asked to wear this particular morning. She looked at him then. She looked at him the way she had looked at her mother in the last hour, with all the softness gone, only the accounting left. She thanked him for his honesty. She said that she did not judge him. She said that a badge on the wrong morning was a heavy thing to carry, that she would remember him kindly. She meant it, though the meaning cost her something she did not have to spare. Then she climbed onto Barnaby's back, rode east out of the yard, past the paddock she had re-roofed, past the chicken coop she had built from scratch after the hawk winter, past the ash tree grove where the small unmarked mound sat covered in the first dry leaves, without looking back. Because to look back was to give Judd Ackerley a picture he did not deserve to carry into old age. The road to Cheyenne was 90 miles of open plain and low country, broken by the limestone teeth of the Cathedral Spires 3 miles south of town. She had counted the $4.20 in her pocket twice while packing, and she knew what $4.20 would buy at a stage stop, and it would not buy 90 miles. It would buy at the outside one night, in a bed, 1 meal, 1 feed of oats for Barnaby before it was gone. She rode anyway. She rode because sitting still on the road outside the Ackerley gate was not an option a woman could survive in October, because motion was the only thing between her and the thought of the ash tree grove. The sky did what sky in Wyoming does in mid-October. It thickened. The clouds came down off the Laramie Range in a wide, slow front, the color of a bruise a week old. So the wind that had been merely cold at dawn began to acquire the specific mean quality that meant snow within the hour. She had grown up in Pennsylvania, had learned Wyoming weather the hard way for 3 winters, knew the taste of the air that preceded the first big fall. It tasted like a coin held under the tongue. Barnaby knew it too. He walked with his ears back, his head lower than he liked, without complaint at her urging him to a faster pace, which was itself a bad sign, because Barnaby complained about everything. She reached the base of the Cathedral Spires at what she judged to be an hour past noon, though the sun had already given up the pretense of showing itself. The road curved along the foot of the limestone wall. The wind coming off the cliff face had picked up a knife edge. She dismounted to walk him through a patch of shale, because that was the kind of ground that broke old mules, so she was leading him across the loose stone when his left foreleg went sideways under him, with a sound she felt more than heard, a wet green stick crack that did not belong to any part of the day she wanted to keep. He did not scream. Barnaby had never been a screamer. He knelt down onto the shale, one leg folded wrong under him, looking at her with the same patient reproach he had shown her on the morning she had first tried to put a bit in his mouth. She knew the leg. She had seen legs like that on a horse of her father's outside Laramie in 1876, and she knew what came next. And she knew that leaving him to freeze on the shoulder of the road while wolves worked their way south from the timberline was not a mercy. She had it in her to grant. She untied the trunk. She unwrapped the oiled cloth around the Colt. She loaded one cartridge into the cylinder with hands that were not entirely her own, and she knelt in the shale beside him, putting her palm flat against the long bone of his cheek, pressing her forehead into the coarse gray hair between his eyes. She told him without speaking aloud that he had been a good mule, that the $3 plus the Sunday dinner had been the best trade of her life, that she was sorry the road had ended here for him. Then she stood up, stepped back the length of her own arm, cocked the hammer, did what needed doing. The sound of the shot bounced off the limestone wall behind her, came back 3 times before the wind swallowed it. Barnaby's body settled without drama into the shale. She stood with the Colt hanging at her side for a long minute. The tears that came were not for Judd Ackerley, not for the coat, not even entirely for Barnaby. They were for the small, unmarked mound in the ash tree grove, for the fact that she had not been able to bring so much as a stone from it, for the compass in the trunk that had belonged to a father who had believed until the last week of his life that a man with a straight line and a good instrument could measure his way clear of any trouble. She let herself cry for the length of time it took the wind to shift half a point. Then she wiped her face on the sleeve of her flannel shirt, unloaded the remaining 5 cartridges into her palm, put them in her pocket, wrapped the Colt back in the oiled cloth, put it in the trunk. Began the slow business of considering what a woman with a trunk, a burlap sack, $4.20, no mule could reasonably expect to survive on the open road with the sky the color it was. The answer she knew was that she could not. Cheyenne was 87 miles east. There were no ranches between here and Chugwater that she could count on for shelter because half of them belonged to men who did business with Judd Ackerley, would send a rider ahead of her out of pure habit. There was no coach until Thursday. There was a westbound freight wagon due at the crossroads on Wednesday morning, but Wednesday morning was 40 hours away. The temperature was already falling toward the number that made 40 hours a fatal proposition for a woman in a flannel shirt. She looked up at the Cathedral Spires. She had passed them 100 times, had never really looked at them because they were the kind of feature a person stopped seeing once they became part of the ride home. Now she looked. She looked at the way the limestone was scored by 10,000 years of wind at the ledges, the fissures, the black patches of shadow that meant something more than shadow. And she remembered with the sudden clarity of a person whose life has narrowed to one decision. A story that Ambrose Grimshaw, the storekeeper, had told her the previous January while she waited out a snow shower in the back of his shop with a cup of chicory coffee warming her hands. Grimshaw had been in Silverbow Gulch since the year the town had a name. He had known a woman named Sadie Hollister who had come out from Ohio in 1873 to marry a silver miner named Ambrose Trask, no relation to Grimshaw himself, who had disappeared in the fall of 1875 after a bad summer that everyone in town pretended not to remember. The official story was that she had run off with a drummer. The unofficial story, the one Grimshaw had told Willa while stoking the potbelly stove behind the counter, was that Sadie Hollister had gone into the Cathedral Spires with a bedroll, plus a bag of flour, had never come back down, that certain hunters over the years had reported the smell of wood smoke coming off the cliff face on still winter nights, when no living soul should have been up there burning anything. She had listened to the story the way one listens to a ghost story from an old man who wants company on a slow afternoon. She had not thought of it since. She thought of it now. She looked at the sky. She looked at the trunk. She looked at the shale road east. Then she began to climb. She left Barnaby where he lay because she had no shovel, no time, and she carried the trunk on her back by looping the burlap sack through its handles and slinging both across her shoulders like a peddler's pack. She carried the Colt in her belt for the first time in her life. She carried a coil of half-inch rope she had cut from the pack saddle, plus the tin of matches inside her shirt against her ribs, where the heat of her body would keep the sulfur dry. She began by following a game trail that switched back 3 times across the lower slope. Then when the game trail gave out, she began to climb by hand, and by the time she had gained the first serious height above the road, she understood that her hands were going to bleed and that her lungs were going to fail her before her legs did. The asthma had been with her since she was 6 years old when she had watched the Kellner sawmill burn from her mother's kitchen window and had breathed the wrong air for an hour before her mother had thought to soak a rag in vinegar and press it over her face. She had learned to manage it. She had a small brown bottle of tincture in the trunk, a paper of dried mint leaves in her pocket for chewing. Knowledge of the specific pace at which her breath would hold, plus the specific pace at which it would not. But there was no pace on a limestone cliff in a rising wind with a trunk on her back that her lungs were willing to negotiate. She stopped 3 times in the first hour to lean her forehead against the cold rock and force her breath down into the bottom of her chest each time the wind grew louder in the fissures above her. Each time the light went a shade grayer. Each time she reminded herself that Sadie Hollister had climbed this cliff in 1875 in a long skirt and had lived to become a story, an old man told for company that if a woman in a long skirt could do it, a woman in canvas trousers could do it too. The first flakes came at what she guessed to be 3 in the afternoon, though her sense of time had begun to unmoor itself. They were not the small, dry flakes of a proper storm. They were the wet, heavy flakes of a warning shot, each one the size of the pad of her thumb, falling almost lazily, clinging to the limestone in slick, coin-shaped patches that turned every handhold into a question. She climbed faster. She could not afford to climb faster. She climbed faster anyway. She had gained perhaps 400 vertical feet above the road when her boots slipped on a patch of new snow over an ice glaze she had not seen. So she went down onto her knees on a narrow ledge. The trunk shifted on her back, pulled her sideways toward a drop she did not want to measure. She caught herself against the root of an uprooted cedar tree that had at some point in a summer she had not witnessed fallen half out of the cliff face, lodge itself in a shelf of scree. She hung against the root for a long moment. She could hear her own breath. She could hear the wind. She could hear faintly a sound she did not immediately place, a sound like air being drawn slowly through a keyhole, coming from behind the tangle of dry roots against her cheek. She pushed the roots aside. Behind them, half hidden by a curtain of pale sedimentary dust and dead sedge grass, was a fissure in the limestone, perhaps 20 inches wide, 3 feet high. The air coming out of it was dry. It was not warm exactly, but it was warmer than the air on the ledge, warmer than the air had any right to be on a cliff face in a rising storm. The difference enough that she understood in a single beat of her heart what she was looking at. She unslung the trunk. She pushed the burlap sack through the fissure, first heard it drop onto stone some little distance beyond. Then she pushed the trunk in ahead of her, edgewise working it through the tight place with the careful patience of a woman threading a needle in poor light. Then she went in herself on her belly, pulled her shoulders through the narrow throat of the passage, felt the limestone scrape a strip of skin off the point of her hip, kept going until her hands found floor and her head cleared the roof until she was able to rise onto her knees inside the mountain. She fumbled the matches out of her shirt with fingers that were beginning to lose their color. She struck one. The flame was small and blue at first, then it caught yellow on the sulfur, and she cupped it with both hands, held it high, saw what she had climbed into. The chamber was the size of a country parlor. The floor was flat where it counted, dished slightly toward the center, as if a slow, patient hand had polished it. The ceiling arched perhaps 12 feet overhead, dark limestone streaked with pale mineral seeps that caught the matchlight in soft threads of silver. Against the far wall stood a stove of native stone mortared with what looked to be a rough mud clay. The flue a stacked chimney of flat rocks disappearing up into a natural crevice in the ceiling that showed when she squinted a faint gray disk of daylight sky at its top. Beside the stove sat a rusted iron kettle. Beside the kettle sat a small mound of split wood gone gray with age, but dry, sheltered from any drip from above by an outcrop of pale rock. Beside the wood sat a rough box, 3 planks nailed together with hand-forged square nails, the wood cedar, the grain still showing faintly through a coat of ancient dust. The match burned down to her fingers. She dropped it before it burned her. She struck another. She knelt beside the stove, reached into the wood, took 2 of the smaller pieces, laid them across the iron grate inside the firebox, took a handful of the dried sedge grass she had pulled through the fissure with her, stuffed it beneath, cupped a third match to the sedge blue once gently from the very bottom of her ruined lungs. The sedge caught. The flame climbed into the wood. The wood, dry as bone from a decade of desert cave air, took the flame with an eager small crack. So within a minute she had a fire the size of both her fists. Within 5 minutes, a fire the size of a bread loaf. Within 20 minutes, a fire that filled the belly of the stone stove with a low, steady roar, the heat coming off the black surface of that stove. The most beautiful thing she had ever put her hands to in her life. She held them out to it. She watched the color come back into the tips of her fingers in the order the cold had taken it. She began without deciding to cry, and the crying was neither the crying of grief nor the crying of relief, but a third thing she had never named before, the crying of a woman who has been told she cannot survive, and who has just discovered alone in a room made of stone that the person who told her was wrong. She let herself cry for perhaps 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face with the cuff of her flannel shirt, got to work, because she had been raised by a bone setter and a surveyor, neither of whom had left her the luxury of collapse. She checked the flue. The draft was strong, steady. She held her palm above the crack in the ceiling and felt the pull of cold air being drawn up past the fire, and she saw with her own eye that no smoke was gathering under the roof of the chamber. Whoever had built the stove had known what they were doing. She checked the walls. The rock was dry to the touch, 6 feet up. There was no sign of the black bloom of mold that would have meant a wet season. She checked the floor near the far wall, found a shallow depression the size of a wash basin, where in some other year someone had lined the stone with clay to make a place to hold meltwater. She checked the box beside the wood. The box was not locked. The lid lifted on leather hinges that had gone brittle. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth the color of tobacco, was a book. She took it out. It was a small book the size of her hand, bound in dark brown calfskin, with a strip of leather thong tied around it to hold the covers closed. The leather was cracked. The thong was stiff. She untied it with the same careful patience she had used with the fisher, because the book felt to her like the kind of object that would fall to pieces if she rushed. The first page bore a name written in a firm woman's hand in brown ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. The name was Sadie Elizabeth Hollister. The date beneath the name was March of 1874. She sat back on her heels. She read the first page. She read the second. She read the third. The wind outside the fissure, invisible now, beyond 10 feet of solid limestone, began to rise into the long, sustained howl of a storm that meant business. The fire crackled in the stone stove. The chamber grew slowly warm, so the smell of wood smoke, plus old cedar, plus dry limestone dust, filled the small round of air she had claimed for herself. And Willa Ashwood read the diary of a woman who had been dead in the mind of a whole town for 10 years, and she began to understand that she had not stumbled into an accident. The pages were a life. They were the life of a woman who had come to the territory to marry a man she had known for 6 weeks by letter, and had discovered in her first summer that he was the kind of man who kept a whip on a nail by the kitchen door. They were the life of a woman who had learned to set snares for snowshoe hare in the second summer, who had traded eggs at the mercantile for a piece of oiled canvas in the third, who had one night in August of 1875 walked out of a house on the edge of Silver Bow Gulch with a bedroll on her back, plus a small hatchet in her belt, plus a resolve in her chest that she wrote down on the first page of the diary in this specific line which Willa read. Once then read again to be certain of it. I would rather die on my own account than live one more hour on his. There were entries about the climb. There were entries about the fissure which Sadie had found by accident chasing a wounded jackrabbit that had gone into it and not come out. There were entries about the building of the stone stove, which had taken her 9 days and had cost her the skin of both palms, plus entries about the finding of the wood, which had come from a lightning-struck cedar Sadie had cut and dragged up the cliff face over the course of a week of nights. There were entries about the winter she had survived in the chamber alone on a diet of rabbit and rendered fat, in one desperate raid on the corn crib of a homestead 6 miles east that she had made on foot in a January thaw. There were entries about the spring. There were entries about a summer of berries and roots, and the discovery of a second smaller chamber behind the first, which Sadie had used as a larder. There were at the very back 3 entries in a different ink written faster, in a hand less steady than the rest. The first said, A took the trail through the notch last week. He does not know I am here yet, but he suspects. The second said, I have decided I cannot risk another winter. I will go north when the weather breaks. I have heard there is work in the Montana camps for a woman who can cook and hold her tongue. The third and last said, if any woman finds this book, know that the stove draws well, and the second chamber holds cold through July. The box beside the wood contains what I could not carry. Use it as you would use your own. I leave what I built here as I would leave a lantern in a window. My name was Sadie Hollister. I hope yours is your own. Willa closed the book. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. The fire spoke in the stove. The wind spoke in the fissure. She looked around the chamber with new eyes, understanding that she was not the first woman to have been thrown off a porch in Wyoming in October, that she would not be the last that a stranger, 10 years dead in the mind of a town, had left her a lantern in a window, that the specific kind of debt she now owed had no name in any language she had been taught, but was nevertheless the most binding debt she had ever incurred in her life. She opened the box again. Under the oilcloth that had wrapped the book, there was a second oilcloth bundle. She unwrapped it. Inside lay a small hatchet with a hickory handle, worn smooth to a color like honey, a bone-handled awl, a rolled leather sheet the size of a table napkin that held a dozen fish hooks plus a spool of gut line, a tin of black powder sealed with wax, plus stamped with a Denver merchant's mark from 1874. A small stoppered glass bottle of what smelled when she uncorked it, like turpentine, a folded square of oiled canvas the size of a bedsheet at the bottom, a rough hand-drawn map on a piece of butcher paper showing the cathedral spires from the south, with 3 small X marks along the cliff face, plus 2 along the ridge above. Beside each X, in the same brown ink as the book, was a single word in Sadie Hollister's firm hand. The words in order were shelter, water, cash at the 2 marks on the ridge above watch plus out. She did not know yet what watch plus out meant. She would find out. For now, she set the map aside, rewrapped the tools, took the book, put it inside her flannel shirt against her ribs, where the matches had been, because the matches were dry now, because the book was a thing that felt like it should be carried against a heartbeat. She fed 2 more pieces of wood into the stove. She loosened her boots. She spread the burlap sack on the floor near the fire, laid herself down on it, took inventory of her body the way her mother had taught her to take inventory of a patient. Fingers pink at the tips, again painful meaning. Circulation returning, meaning no permanent harm. Toes numb but present, meaning the boots had done their work. Lungs tight, dry, whistling faintly at the top of each breath, meaning the asthma was awake, meaning she would need the tincture before she slept. Ribs bruised where the fissure had scraped her but not cracked. Face raw with cold and salt and wind. Mind clear. The last one surprised her. She had expected her mind to be a wreckage. She had walked out of the door of a house that had been her whole life. At 7 in the morning, shot her mule at 1 in the afternoon, climbed a limestone cliff in a snowstorm. At 4, had every right to be lying on a burlap sack in a stone room with her mind gone to pieces. Instead, her mind was clear. It was clear in the specific way a winter sky is clear after a long snow cold, empty without weather. She lay on the sack, watched the shadows move on the ceiling of the chamber, thought with a calm she did not entirely trust about arithmetic. Wyoming winter at this altitude would run 100 days at least before the passes opened. A body her size working at the labor she was about to demand of it would need in the neighborhood of 2,500 calories a day to hold its weight and its warmth. 2,500 multiplied by 100 was 250,000. 250,000 calories was the number between her and the spring. It was a number she could hold in her head. It was a number she could break into pieces, go find piece by piece in the town below her. She thought about the town. She thought about Hattie Boone at the Blue Jay Inn, who had once slid a plate of fried potatoes across the counter to a homeless drover without charging him, who had glared at Willa for noticing. She thought about Ambrose Grimshaw, the storekeeper, who had told her the ghost story of Sadie Hollister, who would, she suspected, keep his mouth shut about a woman buying flour in unusual quantities if the woman handed him coin without asking his opinion. She thought about the pawn shop at the end of Front Street, which had a wall of second-hand axes plus a barrel of half-price nails. She thought about the grain warehouse behind the depot, where the jute sacks stacked against the loading dock at week's end were considered trash by the freighters had more than once made their way home in the arms of the town's poorest women to be cut down into aprons and rugs. She thought about the tannery, where the scraps of hide too small for boots were burned at the end of each week unless someone asked to take them. She thought about 3 weeks. 3 weeks she judged before the first hard freeze locked the trail at the fissure and made it impossible to bring anything up or down. 3 weeks was a schedule. 3 weeks was a piece of work. 3 weeks was survivable. She did not think about Judd Ackerley. She would think about him later in the way one eventually thinks about a splinter when there was time and light and a needle. For now she took a small sip of water from the canteen at her hip, uncorked her mother's tincture bottle, let 3 drops fall on her tongue, felt the licorice and camphor burn open the top of her lungs by a small useful margin, pulled the trunk close, rested her cheek against its rough painted lid, closed her eyes for the first time in 18 hours. Before she slept, she said aloud in the empty chamber the sentence she had been carrying in her chest since the oak door had closed behind her. They threw me out to freeze in the mud. All they did was hand me a mountain. The stone stove crackled at her. The wind in the fissure agreed. Somewhere in the town below, Judd Ackerley was pouring a whiskey for a woman in kid gloves and telling her the story of a hired hand who had gone quietly. He did not know that 70 vertical feet above the road he traveled twice a week. A woman with his ranch in her ledger, her mother's psalms in her trunk, had just done the arithmetic on his life, had found it wanting. He would not know for some time. She meant to see to that. She slept. The fire held. The snow, when it began in earnest, an hour after dark, fell for 9 hours without stopping, covered the tracks of a mule and a woman on the shale road below. So by the time Sheriff Amos Redding rode out at first light on the pretext of checking the crossroads for stragglers, there was nothing left on the road to find. He rode as far as the base of the Cathedral Spires. He stood in the falling snow for perhaps 10 minutes, looking up at the cliff face with the reins slack in his gloved hand. Then he turned his horse east, rode back to town at a slow pace, told anyone who asked that he had seen no sign of her, that a woman in her situation and weather of this kind was almost certainly halfway to Cheyenne by now, or else was not going to reach it. He said the second part very quietly. He did not look when he said it at the Cathedral Spires behind him. Above him, in a room made of stone, Wilhelmina Ashwood woke to a fire that had burned down to a bed of red coals. Fetid opened her father's compass in her palm to check that its needle still swung true. After the cold, drank a swallow of water from the canteen, began to plan the morning's descent into a town that had already begun the slow work of forgetting her name. The descent at dawn was a lesson in how the mountain would test her every day she chose it. New snow had glazed the ledges to the color of milk, so the fissure at the cedar root was harder to leave than it had been to enter, because leaving required her to trust a rope she had not yet tested to the anchor of a root she had not yet assessed in daylight. She tied the coil off around the cedar trunk with a bowline plus a doubled overhand backup, the way her father had shown her on the trestle work outside Rawlins in 1874, lowered herself in 12 short controlled slides down to the shale road below. The colt weighted her belt. The burlap sack, empty now, was folded flat inside her flannel shirt against her stomach, where it would not catch the wind. The trunk stayed in the chamber. Everything of value had to stay in the chamber because she was walking into Silverbow Gulch as a woman with no assets, no address. So a trunk on a woman's back invited questions she did not have the currency to answer. Barnaby was already buried. The overnight snow had done for the mule what she could not do with a shovel, and she was grateful in a small, hard way as she skirted the mound of white on the shoulder of the road. She did not stop to say anything over him. There would be time for that in April, when the melt turned him into a problem for the coyotes. For now she put her back to the cathedral. Spires walked east along the road toward town at the pace of a woman with an errand, because a pace of that kind attracted less attention than any other. The first person she saw was a boy of perhaps 9, driving 3 milk cows across the wagon track toward the town commons. He looked at her without curiosity. She was in his estimation a woman on the road at dawn, of which there were several kinds in Silverbow Gulch, none of them warranting a second look. She kept walking. She passed the Methodist church, which had not been painted since 1881, the assay office, which had a black lantern hanging by its door because the assayer was still asleep. The pole corral behind the livery where a strawberry roan she had once helped deliver was standing three-legged in the corner, favoring the near hind. She did not stop for the horse either. She reached Front Street at the exact moment that Hattie Boone unlocked the front door of the Blue Jay Inn from the inside to set out an iron scraper for boots. Hattie was 52, looked 40 in the right light, 60 in the wrong one. This morning was the wrong light. Her hair was pinned in the tight practical coil of a woman who had been in the kitchen since 4. Her apron carried a burn mark on the hip from a skillet handle she had misjudged the week before. She looked up when the boot scraper hit the porch, saw Willa on the plank sidewalk. Her face did the smallest thing a face can do without moving. Just a tightening at the corner of the mouth, a flick of the eye toward the door of the inn, a small sideways gesture with the head that meant come around back. Willa came around back. The kitchen door was propped open with a chunk of stove wood. The heat coming out of it smelled of bacon grease and cornmeal, and the metallic bite of a griddle that had been in service since Grant's first term. Hattie shut the door behind her, dropped the bar and the brackets, turned to look at her. The look on Hattie's face, the look of a woman who was doing an accounting who did not care whether Willa saw her do it. Sit, Hattie told her. Willa sat on a three-legged stool by the stove. Hattie set a chipped enamel plate in front of her with 2 eggs, a strip of fatback, a heel of cornbread, a cup of coffee so strong it stood up on its own. Willa looked at the plate. She had not eaten since the previous morning, had not thought about eating since the moment on the porch, now understood, with the small shock of the newly reminded that she was very hungry. Eat, Hattie told her, then we talk. She ate. She ate slowly because a stomach that has spent a day in shock will punish speed. But she ate every piece of what was on the plate, drank the coffee. When she was done, Hattie took the plate away without comment, set a wet cloth in front of her for her hands. Only then did Hattie speak. Redding rode past here at first light, Hattie told her. He stopped at the porch for a cup, told me he'd checked the road east and seen no sign of you. He did not look at me when he said it, which means either he saw sign of you and lied about it, or he did not look for sign of you as hard as a sheriff ought to look, or he is a worse liar than any man his age has a right to be. Which of the 3 is it? Willa considered her answer for a beat. Then she told Hattie the truth because she had already decided on the walk down that Hattie Boone was going to be either the second person she trusted in Silverbow Gulch or the last person she trusted anywhere. So there was no reason to spend the currency slowly. She told her about the shale, about Barnaby, about the cedar root, the fissure, the stove of stacked stone. She did not yet tell her about the diary. That felt like a thing to keep behind her ribs until it was asked for. She told Hattie that she meant to stay through the winter. She told her the arithmetic of the 250,000 calories in the flat tone of a woman reading a ledger to a partner. She told her that she was going to need work, that she was going to need it in a way that did not put Hattie in the position of lying to the sheriff, or to Judd Ackerley, or to the wife of any deacon at the Methodist church. Hattie listened without interrupting. When Willa was done, Hattie sat down opposite her on a bench by the flour bin, folded her hands in her lap, looked at the ceiling for perhaps 10 seconds, working through her own private mathematics. Then she looked at Willa. 4 hours a day, Hattie told her. Pots, floors, the ash bucket. 50 cents in coin at the end of each shift off the books out of my own pocket. No ledger entry. Meals when you're here, what's left on the plates when the drovers push back from the counter. You come in the back door before 5. You leave through the back door before 9. You do not speak to my customers. My customers do not speak to you. If Judd Ackerley walks through my front door, you are in the pantry with the door shut. You do not come out until I knock twice. Is that a bargain a woman in your situation can accept? It was. Willa said so. Hattie nodded once as if a contract had been signed in blood on a good piece of parchment, stood up, handed Willa a stiff canvas apron off a peg by the door, so the day of work began without further conversation. The pots at the Blue Jay Inn were cast iron and enameled steel and copper-bottomed tin. They had been fed a decade of bacon grease and burned onion, so Willa scrubbed them with sand and lye soap, and the wire brush Hattie kept in a jar of vinegar under the sink. Her hands, already raw from the cliff, went past raw into something that could no longer be called skin. So she wrapped them in cotton strips at the end of the shift. did not look at them until they were bandaged, because looking at them would not help. She swept the plank floor. She emptied the ash bucket into the pit behind the outhouse. She scraped the griddle. She scoured the coffee pot with fine gravel plus cold water because Hattie insisted that soap ruined the taste of the next pot. She worked without speaking, so the drovers who came in and out for their 9 o'clock coffee did not see her because a woman in an apron behind a swinging kitchen door is in the accounting of drovers. A piece of the furniture. At 9:05, Hattie pressed 2 quarters plus a folded newspaper into her hand, told her without looking up from the batter she was stirring, that Grimshaw's Mercantile got a new shipment on Tuesdays, that the day-old bread at the back of the counter went half price at 3, that the tannery on the north edge of town burned its offcuts on Thursday evenings, but sometimes let a person carry a bundle away on Wednesday afternoon if the person did not make a great deal of noise about it. She also told her in the same tone that a woman named Junie Petrish on Willow Lane had a husband down with rheumatism plus 3 shirts that needed the collars turned that Junie would pay in eggs, plus in the promise of never asking a single question, which was the finest currency available in Silverbow Gulch that season. Willa took the quarters. She took the newspaper. She stepped out the back door of the Blue Jay Inn at 9 on the morning of October 15th, 1885. And she began a routine that would hold with small variations for 20 consecutive days. Grimshaw's Mercantile smelled of coffee beans and coal oil and the faint metallic ghost of nails in an open keg. Ambrose Grimshaw himself was 64, thin as a pump handle, with a white beard cut to a point, plus spectacles perched at the end of his nose, like a badge of some private authority. He looked up when Willa came in. He looked at her for a long moment across the top of the spectacles. He did not say her name. He did not ask her business. He set down the account book he had been marking, came around the counter, locked the front door behind her with a small brass key on a chain around his neck. Only then did he turn back to her, giving her without comment a nod that was neither greeting nor question, but a form of professional acknowledgement. She spent her 50 cents that morning with a care that would have moved her mother to tears. 12 pounds of coarse rye flour at 4 cents the pound wrapped in butcher paper plus tied with twine. 2 pounds of dried pinto beans at 3 cents the pound. 1 pound of rendered lard in a tin can with a paper label showing a fat pig in a bow tie. A 1/4 pound of salt. A tin of sulfur matches to replace the one she had opened. A small paper twist of black tea because tea was cheaper than coffee and would stretch further because the tannin would help with the specific way her stomach was going to have to work in the coming weeks. She left the store with a bundle that weighed 16 pounds, carried it out the back door onto the alley behind the Mercantile, because Grimshaw had, without asking her, held open the back door for her rather than the front. She spent an hour at the tannery. The proprietor, a man named Osborne, who had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a fleshing knife, in 1878, did not look at her when she asked about scraps. He simply pointed with the stub of his index finger at a pile of hide trimmings by the burn barrel, told her that anything smaller than a saucer she could take, anything larger she could not. That if she came back on a Wednesday afternoon at 4, he would put the softer pieces on the top of the pile without saying anything to anyone about it. She thanked him. He grunted. She left with 3 pounds of soft cowhide trimmings the size of small books, which would, she calculated, line half of one wall of the chamber if she cut them right. She spent another hour at the grain warehouse behind the depot. The freighter on the loading dock, a red-faced man named Reynolds, whose left ear had been frostbitten off in a January she remembered, did not lift his eyes from the manifest he was tallying. He said into the manifest that any jute sack with a torn seam was a sack the railroad would not pay him to send back to Denver, that a sack of that description on the ground beside the dock was, in his estimation, a sack that had been thrown away by God. She counted 11 jute sacks with torn seams on the ground beside the dock. She took all 11. She folded them flat, rolled them into a bundle she tied with a length of twine from her pocket, left the depot at 10 minutes past noon with a load she could barely see over the top of. She did not go straight to the fissure. She went first to Willow Lane, to the small clapboard house with a green shutter loose on its top hinge, knocked on the back door with her elbow because her hands were full. Junie Petrish, a woman of 35 with a face already worn down to the bones by too much wind, plus 1 child buried in the same season Willa had buried hers, opened the door, looked at Willa, the way a drowning woman looks at a rope. Junie brought her 3 linen shirts with the collars gone through, plus a paper of pins and thread, plus 1 boiled egg still warm from the kettle. Willa took the shirts, the pins, the thread. She took the egg. She sat on the back stoop in the wan noon sun and turned the collar of the first shirt while Junie stood in the doorway and watched without speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said between 2 women who had lost the same weight of the world in the same year. Willa handed the first shirt back finished in 11 minutes. Junie put 4 more eggs into a scrap of newsprint, folded it around them, pressed it into Willa's hand. Willa took the eggs. Neither of them thanked the other. Some transactions carry their own thanks inside them. She left Junie's yard at 1:20 with 16 pounds of dry goods, 3 pounds of hide trimmings, 11 jute sacks, 5 eggs, a small piece of gingerbread that Junie's oldest boy had pressed into her hand at the gate without being told to. So she walked the 3 miles back to the base of the Cathedral Spires with her jaw set. Because a load of that size on a woman's back over 3 miles of frozen road was a punishment her body had not been asked to accept since the season she had helped her father run the transit line up the North Platte in her 16th summer. The climb that first day took her 4 hours going up. She had not yet rigged the rope well enough. She had not yet cut the switchbacks she would come to know by heart. She had not yet understood that a load could be broken into 2 smaller loads and hoisted up the last 50 vertical feet by a system Sadie Hollister had 10 years earlier hinted at with her cryptic mark of "Watch Plus" out on the ridge above. She did the whole climb on her back, the last 100 feet on hands and knees. So when she pushed the bundles through the fissure ahead of her at 5:04 in the afternoon, the light in the chamber was already going purple. At the edges, her lungs were doing the whistling thing again. She had to sit against the wall for 20 minutes before she could stand up to feed the stove. That was the first day. There would be 20 of them. Each one was worse than the last in the accounting of her body, better than the last in the accounting of her stores. On the third day, she found at the back of the second chamber Sadie had mentioned in the last diary entry a small oaken block plus a set of iron pulleys wrapped in a piece of tarred canvas. The pulleys were the 4-fold kind used on freight wagons for hauling heavy crates up onto loading docks. The block was the double kind that matched them. So when she cleaned the rust off the sheaves with a rag soaked in the turpentine from the box, she found that the wheels still turned. A 4-to-1 mechanical advantage was not a small gift. It was the difference between hauling 50 pounds up a cliff on her back, plus hauling 200 pounds up the same cliff. With the same effort provided, she had a place to anchor the standing block, plus a length of rope longer than the one she had. The rope she solved on the 5th day by walking into the pawn shop at the end of Front Street, trading her mother's pewter thimble for a 50-foot coil of half-inch hemp line that the proprietor pretended not to look her in the face while measuring. The thimble had been her mother's for 31 years. She did not permit herself to think about it after she set it down on the counter. Some prices you paid, then you kept walking, because turning around to look at the thing you had spent would only cost you a second time. The anchor she solved on the 7th day by climbing to the ridge above the fissure at first light and finding exactly where the map had promised a natural bollard of limestone, the size and shape of a hitching post growing straight up out of the rock. From the top of the bollard, she could see on a clear morning 30 miles of open country in 3 directions, so the wagon road from Silverbow Gulch to Cheyenne unspooled beneath her like a piece of pale thread. Watch plus out, she understood now, meant the place from which to see who was coming, plus the way to leave without being seen. She set the pulleys at the bollard. She rigged a running line down through the fissure to a second anchor she made by driving 2 iron spikes into a crack in the chamber wall, securing them with the last of Sadie's tar. She tested the system with the trunk. The trunk came up the last 50 feet of cliff face in 9 minutes, at the cost of a mild burn along the inside of her right forearm from the rope. So she sat on the ridge above her chamber with the trunk beside her, permitted herself one small hard smile. By the end of the first week, she had a rhythm. She was down the cliff on the road before dawn, at the Blue Jay before 5 at Grimshaw's, before 10 at Junie's, or at the tannery, or at the depot before noon, back at the base of the cliff by 2, up the cliff by 3, feeding the stove by 4, boiling snowmelt for the next day's water by 5, mending or copying or writing in her own new ledger by 6, asleep on the burlap and hide pallet she had built against the far wall by 7:30. She kept the ledger in the back of the diary on the blank pages Sadie had left, because that felt to her like a kind of continuation Sadie would have understood. She weighed her stores every third day on a small tin scale Grimshaw had loaned her without comment on the second Tuesday. By the end of the second week, she had accumulated 48 pounds of rye flour, 31 pounds of dried beans, 11 pounds of rendered lard in 3 tins, 4 pounds of salt, 1 pound of black tea, 2 pounds of dried apples she had bought at a discount because they had gone slightly gray at the edges, 6 pounds of jerked beef from a rancher named Halverson, who paid her in jerky for turning 6 of his shirt cuffs, a pint jar of Hattie's blackberry preserves that Hattie had set out on the back stoop of the kitchen one morning without a note attached. From a widow named Mrs. Peabody, whose son had lately died of typhoid in Laramie, whose pantry was being reduced to essentials, she had received a full crock of sourdough starter that Mrs. Peabody had set into her handkerchief. Needed a woman who would talk to it kindly. She also had, by the end of the second week, 20 gallons of water in wooden buckets stacked against the far wall of the chamber, hauled up in relays from a spring half a mile along the ridge that ran ice-free through a small overhang until the middle of December in a normal year. She had a wall of firewood stacked 5 feet deep and 7 feet high along the north side of the stove, cut in the timber a quarter-mile south of her ridge with an axe she had bought at the pawn shop for 80 cents. She had 4 of the 11 jute sacks slit open and pinned to the walls with wooden pegs she had whittled from stove kindling, forming a rough insulating layer between her body and the stone. She had a pallet raised 6 inches off the floor on scavenged pine slats insulated beneath with dry cedar bark, plus a layer of the hide trimmings from Osborne's burn pile. She had rewritten her mother's herbal receipts onto the last 3 blank pages of Sadie's diary, in the small, careful hand she had inherited from her father, because paper was a resource she could not replenish, because the receipts belonged with the rest of the lantern in the window. She had lost by the end of the second week 15 pounds off a frame that had not carried a spare pound in 3 years, so her cheekbones had begun to show in a way that made her look in the small hand mirror she used in the chamber like a woman older than 32 by some measurable margin. Her hands were a topography of cracks and calluses. Her boots had thinned at the shanks to the point where she felt the shape of individual pebbles through the leather. Her lungs whistled at the top of every third breath. The tincture bottle was down to a quarter full. She counted her matches every night, kept the count in the back of the ledger. It was on the 12th day, while she was pulling a piece of split cedar from the woodpile to feed the evening fire, that she noticed the small dark seam at the back of the pile where the stone of the far wall did not quite meet the floor. She had thought it was a crack. It was not. It was a passage low waist-high at its highest point, running back into the rock some distance she could not at first measure. She fetched her lamp from beside the stove, crawled in on her hands and knees, came out 15 feet later into a second chamber, roughly a third the size of the first coal dry, utterly still with a shelf of natural stone running along the far wall at chest height. On the shelf lay 3 things. The first was a small bundle wrapped in a piece of oiled deer hide that fell apart when she touched it, revealing a heap of pale, brittle bones the size and shape of a large house cat, which she understood after a moment of studying the skull was the wildcat Sadie must have snared in that final autumn and hung to cure and never come back for. The second was a cast-iron Dutch oven with the lid still fitted dust-caked but otherwise intact. The third was a folded square of butcher paper tucked under the Dutch oven, which when she opened it read in the same brown ink as the diary, but hastier now less measured the words A came within a mile of the fissure on the morning of September 9th. I did not sleep for 2 days. I will leave tonight for the road north. If you are reading this, know that I did not die here. Know that a woman can leave the mountain the way she came and go on. S.H. She sat back on her heels in the second chamber with the paper in her hand. She read the note 3 times. She thought about the way she had on the first night believed that Sadie had died in the chamber, had drawn from that belief a kind of dark determination that a dead woman's shelter would become a living woman's fortress. Now she understood with a slow reordering of her sense of the world that the shelter had not been a monument. It had been a stepping stone. Sadie had used it. Then Sadie had walked out of the fissure at the end of a bad summer. Then Sadie had gone somewhere, so Sadie might, for all Willa knew, still be alive, at 55, in some other town, in some other territory, running a boarding house, or teaching children their letters, or standing at a kitchen window watching snow fall on somebody else's cattle. The chamber was not the end of the story. The chamber was where the story turned. Willa carried the note back to the main chamber, laid it inside the front cover of the diary. She sat for a long time by the stove, with her hands in her lap, thinking about a woman she had never met and would never meet, about the specific gift a stranger can leave for a stranger without knowing the stranger's name. It was on the morning of the 18th day at 10 past 11 that she walked into Grimshaw's Mercantile for the last of her scheduled purchases and found Judd Ackerley at the counter. He had his back to her. He was reading a label on a can of coal oil, holding it up to the light of the front window. Beside him, Cordelia Whitfield was fingering a bolt of red wool flannel with an expression of appraisal that Willa recognized from 3 years of watching Judd assess yearling steers. There was a cart outside the front window, loaded to the top rail with goods that Willa's eye cataloged in one sweep. A new cast-iron parlor stove of the ornate Chicago pattern with a nickel filigree on the door, 2 crates marked in stenciled black letters as coal oil, a bag of rock salt for melting ice, a slab of butchered beef wrapped in muslin, a case of tinned peaches from California, a rolled bundle of new wool blankets from the Denver mills tied to the tailgate, a live goose in a slat cage that looked at Willa with the flat, resentful stare of a bird that had been recently upset. She did not turn to leave. She could have turned to leave. Grimshaw, behind the counter, made the smallest possible movement of his head toward the back door, the way a man signals a rescue to a person who has not yet asked for one. Willa let him see her not take the offer. She stepped up to the counter 3 feet down from Judd Ackerley, laid on the polished wood the 3 items she had come in for: a tin of sulfur matches waxed for winter storage, a stoppered bottle of coal oil for her lamp, a 10-pound sack of coarse yellow cornmeal. Judd turned when he heard the tin hit the counter. He turned slowly in the way of a man who has already been informed by some peripheral sense whose face he is about to see, so his expression when it arrived on his own features was not the expression Willa had expected. She had expected surprise. She had expected shame. She had expected at the outside a moment of the flat, controlled irritation she had seen on his face the morning he had turned her out. What she saw instead was worse. It was pleasure, not large pleasure, small pleasure. The pleasure of a man handed an unexpected small entertainment on a morning he had not planned to enjoy. His voice when it arrived carried the peculiar warmth of a man performing for a woman standing beside him, rather than speaking to the woman standing in front of him. Well, he told the store in the general direction of the tinware shelf, "Look at what has come back to us." Cordelia Whitfield did not turn. She kept her hand on the red flannel, kept her chin at the same angle it had been, gave the smallest possible sideways cut of her eye, to indicate that she was in possession of the situation, did not intend to dignify it with the full attention of her face. Judd continued. He was not, Willa recognized, entirely sober. It was 11 in the morning. He had come to town with money in his pocket, a woman on his arm, a wagon of expensive winter goods behind him. He had stopped at the saloon before the Mercantile, because the saloon was on the way, because he was in the newer version of himself that Cordelia had permitted him to become a man who now stopped at saloons before mercantiles. His breath when it reached her carried a note of rye whiskey, a note of tobacco, a note of something sweetened, perhaps a brandy syrup. "I had heard," he told the tinware, "that you had gone to Cheyenne. I had heard from Reading that the road east had not been able to hold you. But here you are, on the plank floor of Ambrose's shop, buying matches in a coat that has seen better days. Are you sleeping in a barn now, Willa? Have you found yourself a nice horse blanket by the fire at some drover's camp on the Chugwater? Tell me. I am curious. A man likes to know what has become of his charity cases." The word charity did what he had intended it to do. It made Grimshaw behind the counter look down at the polished wood. It made the 2 shopping matrons at the yardage table 3 feet away go still. It made Cordelia Whitfield permit herself the smallest smile she had smiled that year. Willa did not answer for a long beat. She looked at the tin of matches on the counter. She looked at the coal oil. She looked at the sack of cornmeal. Then she looked without hurry at Judd Ackerley, at him, the way a woman looks at a piece of wet leather she is deciding whether to bother salvaging. So she spoke. "Judd," she told him, in the calm, level voice she had used the morning she set down the 2 tin cups on the porch rail, I have no idea what became of your charity cases. I have never met one, but I would encourage you to see to the flue on that Chicago stove before you set fire in it. Cast iron of that gauge from the East Coast foundries has been running hot this year in cold country. My father wrote before he died about 6 houses in the North Platte Cut that suffered chimney fires in 1 January from those exact foundry patterns. If your flue is not tested and lined and properly drafted, you and your bride will spend Christmas breathing your own smoke if you spend Christmas at all. She let the words settle on the polished wood of the counter beside the matches. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean in. She turned her head half an inch toward Cordelia. Whitfield spoke to Cordelia now in the same measured tone. "Ma'am," she told her, "if you have any influence over the man you have decided to marry, I would encourage you to send for a chimney man out of Cheyenne to test that flue before it is fired. It is a small expense that may save your life. I say this only because I understand from Ambrose Grimshaw that you were raised in a good house in Denver, so a good house is a thing worth keeping." Cordelia for the first time turned her head fully. Her face had gone a shade she did not carry well in the light of the front window. She did not answer. She could not answer because to answer would have been to acknowledge that a woman in a mended flannel shirt with a tin of matches on the counter had spoken to her not as a rival, but as an adult, offering advice on a matter of household safety. Cordelia Whitfield had not been prepared at 11 in the morning in a mercantile in Silverbow Gulch to be treated as a person in need of adult advice by anyone at all. Willa put a 50-cent piece down on the counter. She nodded to Grimshaw. She picked up her 3 items, put them in the burlap sack from inside her shirt, walked to the front door of the mercantile, at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, stepped out onto the plank sidewalk, turned east toward the base of the Cathedral Spires, without looking back through the front window of the store, because there was nothing behind that window that she needed to see again. Behind her in the store, Judd Ackerley stood for a beat too long at the counter without speaking. Cordelia Whitfield turned back to the red wool flannel with a slightly harder set to her mouth than she had shown all morning. So Ambrose Grimshaw, quietly without lifting his eyes, made a small notation in the account book on the counter that would prove useful several weeks later to a United States Marshal who had not yet arrived in town. She reached the fissure at 2:10. The wind was up. The sky had begun to do the thing it did in the 2 days before real weather. A false clearing that revealed the mountains too sharply, left the color of everything, a shade too vivid, as if the world was posing for a photograph before something changed. She had been on the ridge above the chamber that morning to check her waterline, had noted the falling barometer in the flat glass tube of the small brass instrument Grimshaw had let her borrow with the understanding that she would return it in the spring. The needle had dropped a full point overnight. By that afternoon, when she came in from her run to town, it had dropped another 2. She climbed to the ridge one more time with the last load of firewood before dark. She stood on the bollard, looked west, saw a wall of cloud the color of bruised iron rising above the far ridges, saw the low front edge of it draped in the smoky veil that meant heavy snow beneath, saw at the very base of the wall the faint pale flash of lightning inside the belly of it, which in Wyoming in November was a sign that the storm was carrying a colder mass behind it than it was showing in front. She stood on the bollard for perhaps 3 minutes. Then she climbed down through the fissure into the chamber, began to seal the entrance in earnest. She had prepared the materials the previous week. A heavy square of oiled canvas she had bought from Reynolds at the depot for a quarter cut to the exact dimensions of the fissure. 4 flat stones the size of her head that she had carried up the cliff over 3 trips. 2 lengths of rope. She laid the canvas over the fissure from the inside, weighted the bottom edge with 2 stones set into pockets she had cut for them, jammed the top edge into the crack of rock above with the other 2 stones. The result would not have satisfied a builder, but it would hold air on the inside, plus keep snow on the outside, which was the only test that mattered. She fed the stove. She checked the buckets. She checked the flue. She sat on the pallet with the diary open in her lap, read the last entry of Sadie Hollister's for perhaps the 20th time because she had over the course of 2 weeks come to treat that entry as a form of grace before meals. Outside, the wind found the fissure. It began to speak. First a low, wide hum in a pitch she had not heard from a Wyoming wind. Before then, a sharper note as the flow narrowed, plus the pressure rose then, a keening that carried through the canvas, plus the stones, plus the 20 feet of solid limestone above her chamber as a thin whistle at the edge of hearing. The stove crackled cheerfully against the sound. The burlap of the jute sacks catching the firelight threw a soft gold across the ceiling. She was reading at 11 past 9 that first night when she thought she heard beneath the wind a voice. She sat up. She held her breath. The whistle at the fissure changed, pitch dropped by a semitone. As a gust hit it broadside beneath the change, she heard distinctly this time what her mind at first refused to name. It was the small, unmistakable sound of a child crying low, worn, given up on being heard. She set the diary aside. She took the lamp from beside the stove. She crossed the chamber to the passage at the back, lowered herself onto her belly, looked into the second chamber, so she saw in the wavering pool of yellow light a small figure pressed into the corner behind the Dutch oven, with a threadbare blanket pulled around a set of shoulders no larger than a 12-year-old's. A pair of dark eyes catching the lamp with the wet reflection of a raccoon at a garbage pit. The shape of a face she had not expected to see in her own life or in any other. The boy did not move. He was too cold to move, was too frightened to move, had in the small, terrible arithmetic of his own recent history decided that any movement would end whatever Grace had just entered his hiding place with a lamp. Willa lowered the lamp until it sat on the floor of the passage between them. Then she spoke very softly in the calm, level voice she had used with the sheriff, with Hattie Boone, with Judd Ackerley on the plank floor of the Mercantile that morning, the voice her mother had used when picking splinters out of the palm of a child who did not know her. "You are welcome to stay by my fire," she told him. "Nobody in this chamber is going to send you back to any place you ran from. My name is Willa. What is yours?" The wind above them threw itself against the mountain with a new weight. The canvas at the fissure creaked in its stones. The fire in the stove spoke into the small silence between the two of them, as if it had been waiting for the introduction all along would now stand witness to whatever the two of them decided to become to each other. The boy's name, when he gave it, took 2 nights to arrive in full. On the first night, he offered only the English piece "Little Dear" in a voice so hoarse she understood he had not spoken to another human being in the better part of a month. On the second night, once she had put a bowl of rye porridge with lard and a spoonful of Hattie's blackberry preserves into his hands, and watched him eat with the slow, careful pace of a child who had been taught that hunger was a private matter. He told her the whole of it. Ohanko in the language of his mother's people, the syllables placed as gently on the air as if he were setting them down on a shelf where nothing could break them. He was 12. His mother had died of the smallpox at the agency in the spring of 1883, his father the following winter, so he had been placed by the Indian Bureau on a train east in the September of 1884, along with 14 other boys, none of whom he had known before, to the school at Carlisle in Pennsylvania. He had lasted 11 months. He had walked out of a laundry yard on a Sunday morning in August, worked his way west along the rail lines, riding under tarps in cattle cars, once for 3 days in the false floor of a covered wagon, driven by a preacher who did not ask questions but hummed a great deal. He had come across the Cathedral Spires by accident, following a game trail up the shale, crawled into her fissure 2 days before the storm, because the sky had told him what the sky told everything, living on the plains that week, which was that a thing was coming that would not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty in the matter of shelter. Willa did not ask him what he had eaten on the road. She could see the answer in the shape of his wrists. She fed him 3 times that first day in small quantities, with the same discipline her mother had used for cholera patients. Recovering their appetites made him drink a cup of weak tea with a spoon of lard stirred in for the fat. Watched him fall asleep, sitting up against the wall of the second chamber, with the empty bowl still in his hand. She moved him then, very carefully. Onto the pallet, covered him with the wool blanket Mrs. Peabody had traded her for a mended shawl the previous week, stood over him, for a moment with the lamp in her hand. Thought about the small, unmarked mound in the ash tree grove, about how the mound was in one country and the sleeping boy was in another, about how a woman's heart is a strange and inconvenient organ that does not consult her before deciding what to do with the room it has spent 2 years keeping empty. He was awake before her the next morning. She found him at the stove, feeding kindling with a competence that told her he had grown up around wood fires. So she said nothing to him about it, because a boy who has taken initiative in a strange house on his first morning is a boy who does not need to be praised, only trusted to keep going. She poured them both tea. She sat down opposite him. She laid out for him in the same tone she had used with Hattie Boone across the kitchen bench the terms of the arrangement she was proposing. He would stay through the winter. That was not negotiable. She would not put him back on the mountain in November for any reason. He would help her with the work. He would sleep in the second chamber, which she would fit up for him with the second wool blanket, plus the smaller of the two hide pallets, because a person needed a room of his own to keep his mind from folding in on itself. In exchange, she would teach him whatever he wanted to learn. Reading if he wanted it. Arithmetic if he wanted it. The names of the herbs in her mother's book if he wanted it. She would not, she promised him, ever teach him the word for what he was, in the specific vocabulary of the men who had put him on the train. Would not, she promised him, ever ask him to answer to Little Dear. If he preferred, Ohanko would use whichever name he told her to use on any given morning without noting the change. He looked at her across the tin cups for a long moment. Then he asked her in careful, clean English whether she was going to send him back if the sheriff came up the mountain. She told him no. He asked her whether she was going to send him back if the storm broke and there were men on the road below asking questions. She told him no. He asked her whether she was going to send him back if the men on the road were paying money for a boy of his description. She understood, from the specific way he asked it, that this had already happened to him at least once. She told him no in the same measured tone, added that she would put a bullet in her own front door before she would put him on any train going east. That if he required proof of that, she would show him the Colt in the trunk that afternoon, teach him how to use it before dark. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded once, very small, drank the rest of his tea, so the arrangement was in force. The storm ran 12 days. It ran without pause on the first 4, without mercy on the middle 6, with a false apologetic sweetness on the last 2, dusting a fresh half-foot of new snow over what it had already delivered, as if trying to smooth its own record. She had prepared for 8 days, had banked for 12, so by the last of those 12, she was rationing tea, plus stretching. The lard Ohanko was drawing on the flat pages at the back of the ledger, small, careful maps of a country she did not recognize. So she did not ask him to explain, because she understood that some things a person draws for himself. They kept the fire small during the days, plus large during the coldest hours before dawn. They kept the flue clean by knocking it twice a day with the handle of the axe, at which sound a fall of pale soot would sift down onto the stove. Ohanko would sweep it into the ash bucket without being asked. They kept themselves clean by the method Willa's mother had used in the diphtheria week, which was a basin of hot water, plus a rag, plus 1 square of yellow soap, divided into 6 pieces to last a season. They ate twice a day, lay down early, rose late, because sleep was a form of caloric preservation, because talking used up the same reserves as walking at a slower rate. They talked anyway. On the 5th night of the storm, with the wind at a pitch that made the canvas at the fissure creak like a barn door in a summer squall, Ohanko asked her about the diary he had seen her reading on his first evening. She read him passages. She read him the entry about the finding of the fissure, the entry about the building of the stove, the entry about the raid on the corn crib in the January thaw. She did not at first read him the last entries. She was not certain how a boy of 12 would receive the news that a woman had escaped a bad marriage by walking out of a mountain and going north on foot in September, because the shape of that story was the shape of his own recent life, so she did not want to hand him a template he was already living. He asked on the 7th night if there were more entries. She read him the last one, then watched his face while she read. So when she was done, he sat very still, looked at the fire for a while, then he told her in the careful, clean English he was learning to trust with her, that his mother had told him once before. The smallpox took her voice, that people who leave are sometimes not lost, but only walking. She wrote that sentence down that night at the back of the ledger, because it seemed to her that it belonged in the same book as the rest. On the 9th night, she read him the entry about a woman named Sadie, who had lived in Ohio before she came to the territory, who had loved a younger brother named Ezekiel more than any other person on earth. Sadie had written in her diary in the September of 1874 that if she died in this mountain, she wanted her Zeke to know that she had not gone because of him and had not stayed away because of him. That if he grew up to be the man she believed he could be, he would understand that a sister sometimes leaves not to hurt the one she loves, but to save herself for a future that includes them. Willa read this passage carefully in a voice held level, and she did not at the time know why she felt she should mark the name Ezekiel in her own memory. But she did mark it. She would find in the second month of 1886 that the marking had done more work than she had asked of it. The eighth day of the storm brought their first true fight over a decision. The wind had shifted in the middle of the night, had begun driving snow directly against the canvas at the fissure, packing it into a drift that would by morning weigh enough to buckle the top rope. Willa understood, listening to the sound the canvas made, that if the drift held another 2 hours, she would have a serious problem with the exchange of air. She proposed to Ohanko that she would tie herself off at the anchor spikes, go out through the fissure, to clear the drift with the axe handle. Ohanko told her in a tone she had not yet heard from him that she would not do that. He would do it. She was heavier, would fall harder if the rope did not hold. She was the woman who could carry things down the mountain in the spring. He was the boy who weighed 65 pounds, could get in and out of the fissure without pulling the top rope out of alignment. She told him he was 12 years old. He told her he was 12 years old, had crossed 900 miles alone. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she rigged the rope for his weight, stood at the fissure, with the standing end wrapped around her forearm, watched him crawl out into the wind. With the axe handle in his hand, counted the seconds under her breath until he crawled back in. The count was 94 seconds. He came back with snow in his hair, a bloody scrape along the back of one wrist, a look on his face of a boy who had just found out in the middle of a storm that he was going to survive it in the specific company of a woman who let him do things he was capable of doing. She did not remark on the look. She only wrapped his wrist in a strip of cotton, made him tea with the last of the honey. Junie Petrish had pressed into her pocket, in the second week wrote, in the ledger the exact sentence he had used at the fissure, I weigh 65 pounds, so the rope will hold. She thought it belonged to him, that it should be preserved. While the two of them were sealed in the mountain, other clocks were running below. The fire at the Ackerley homestead began on the 5th day of the storm, at what would later be reconstructed by Sheriff Redding as roughly 3 o'clock in the morning. The new Chicago parlor stove had been fired up in the sitting room without the flue being tested by any chimney man out of Cheyenne, because Cordelia Whitfield had believed such advice offered in a mercantile by a woman with a tin of matches on the counter to be beneath the dignity of a Denver house. The flue draft was insufficient. The stove ran too hot on the coals Judd had banked before he had gone to bed drunk with the news of a small ranching disagreement at the west fence. Creosote deposits in a chimney that had never been swept caught in the upper section of the flue where it passed the roofline. The roof timbers dry with 2 years of Wyoming wind took the fire in perhaps 11 minutes. Cordelia Whitfield, who had been the first to smell the smoke, because she had been the one who had not yet permitted herself to sleep deeply in a house, she still counted as provisional. Dressed in 9 minutes flat, packed a carpet bag with the pocket watch. The cameo brooch, the deed she had persuaded Judd to sign the previous week, transferring a 40% interest in the beef cattle to her name against the future value of her father's supposed Denver assets, plus the small lock box in the front parlor that held $832 in $20 gold pieces, which Judd had drawn from the Cheyenne Bank the previous Friday to have on hand for the Christmas wedding. She woke Judd. She told him the house was on fire. She told him she was going to hitch the sleigh. She left the house through the front door, walked to the barn, hitched the sleigh, drove the sleigh east at a speed that suggested the fire had not surprised her nearly as much as it might have surprised anyone else who had spent an evening watching a badly drafted stove throw sparks against a chimney flue. Judd went out through the back porch in his union suit, plus his boots, plus one canvas coat with his forearm across his face against the smoke. He tried briefly to save the horses in the barn. The barn had not caught yet. He got two saddled, the third came loose in the yard, ran off into the timber in a direction he would never see it in again. He mounted the second horse. He rode west along the wagon road at what he believed to be a pursuit of the sleigh, because in the flame-lit dark he had misread which direction the sleigh runners had cut. It was only when he reached the crossroads where the sleigh tracks had gone east that he understood he had been riding in the wrong direction for the better part of an hour, that the sleigh was by now 4 miles ahead of him on the road to Cheyenne, that the woman driving it was not intending to be caught. He rode back through his own tracks. He rode through the burning yard, past the collapsed roof of the sitting room, past the ash tree grove, where the small, unmarked mound sat under 2 feet of new snow, past the paddock, past the chicken coop, out onto the open road east. He rode east because Cheyenne was east, because Cordelia had ridden east, because he had, in his sudden combustion of pride, decided that he would follow her to Denver on horseback if he had to, that he would present himself at the door of the First National Bank of Denver, plus demand an audience with her father that he would make her pay for a wedding that no longer had a house to be brought into. The storm caught him on the second day of his ride. He had not stopped to reprovision. He had a canteen of whiskey plus a canvas coat plus one saddled horse plus no coat over the Union suit under the coat. The storm turned the road east into a white tunnel with no walls. He lost the road twice in the first afternoon. He camped on the first night under a cut bank of the Chugwater with a fire he could not keep lit for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. He rode on the second morning in a direction he no longer trusted his own compass to confirm. By the sixth day of the storm, when Sheriff Redding had gathered enough men in Silverbow Gulch to begin the first serious search, Judd Ackerley had been missing for 4 days. Redding had ridden to the ranch on the third day, found the wreck of the house, found no bodies in the ashes, found the sleigh tracks going east, understood immediately from a scrap of paper he pulled out of the study wall that Cordelia Whitfield had left the ranch with, more than she had come to it with. That Judd Ackerley was somewhere alone in a blizzard on a horse he probably did not have the sense to keep alive. On the seventh day, Redding led 4 riders out along the wagon road east, then west, then along the base of the Cathedral Spires in the last light of the afternoon. Coal oil lanterns swinging from their saddle horns, calling Judd's name into a wind that returned it to them without interest. None of them looked up. None of them thought to look up. If they had looked up, they might have seen on the ridge above the fissure the faint gray thread of smoke Willa let out of the flue only twice a day at dawn, and at dusk when the light in the sky was of a color that would mask it. They did not look up. They rode east. They rode west. They rode past the base of the cliff on the 8th, the 9th, the 10th days of the storm in ever-widening arcs, without ever seeing the thing they were looking for, because Judd Ackerley, by the 10th day, had circled back on his own trail 3 times, was now, without knowing it, within 1.5 miles of the base of the Cathedral Spires, riding in slow, blind loops through the timber a half-mile south of the wagon road. On the 11th night of the storm, sometime after midnight, his horse, whose name was Corporal, whose left hind pastern he had ignored for 2 days, on the grounds that a horse with a limp was better than no horse at all, put his foreleg into a hole covered by drift snow, went down onto his knees with a wet crack that no man who has ridden a horse for 20 years would fail to recognize. Judd was thrown clear. He landed against the trunk of a fallen cedar with the sound of a body hitting a fallen cedar. His right forearm broke against a knot at the shoulder of the tree. His right hip took the impact of the fall. Corporal lay where he had gone down, screaming in the specific way a horse screams when a leg has gone the wrong way, until Judd, with his left hand shaking, unholstered the pistol at his belt and put 3 shots into the horse's head, the third of which finally did what the first 2 had not. Then he sat in the snow beside the body. He sat there because he could not stand. He sat there because his forearm had gone from pain to a dull, ringing absence he did not have the sense to be afraid of. He sat there because the wind had begun the specific work of pulling the heat out of a man's core in the way that killed men before it froze them, because he had, without warning himself, begun to understand that he was going to die on the flank of the Cathedral Spires. 3 miles from a town where his own name was posted on a courthouse ledger under the word missing on the wrong side of a horse he had never bothered to name until he was about to shoot. She was reading the ledger by lamplight. Ohanko was asleep in the second chamber. The stove had settled into the low, steady hum of a fire, tended by a woman who had learned exactly how much wood a body needed at midnight in a cave. And she was in the middle of reviewing the arithmetic of her stores for the next 30 days when a sound came through the fissure that was not a wind noise. It was, she thought at the time, a horse crying, not the whinny of a healthy animal. The sound a horse makes when a leg has gone the wrong way, and it knows it. She set the ledger down. She listened. The sound came again, closer, carrying under it the shape of a human voice raised in an exclamation that the wind stole before she could hear the words. Then there were 3 pistol shots, spaced the way a man shoots when he has decided a horse cannot be saved, but he is doing the last mercy anyway. Then a longer sound, a muffled crash of a body against something. Then nothing. She stood at the fissure with the lamp in her hand for perhaps a minute. She was calculating in her head the distance the sound had traveled, the shape of the country between the base of the cliff and the road, the number of minutes a man could survive at the temperature currently being maintained outside the fissure without moving. The number of minutes came to 18. 18 was not enough for her to rig the pulley's dress for the descent, lower herself to the road, find a man in a snowdrift by the sound of her own breathing. 12 maybe was enough. 12 required her to have prepared the descent equipment in advance, which she had. 12 required her to have a second person at the anchor to work the standing block, which she also unaccountably now had. She turned from the fissure. Ohanko was already awake in the second chamber, propped up on his elbow with the blanket around his shoulders, his eyes catching the lamplight in the same wet, reflective way they had caught it on the first night. So he had heard the shots too, understood in the same beat she did what was being asked of them both. She spoke to him in the calm, level voice, but the calm, level voice was thinner now than it had ever been in her ownership of it. "There is a man at the bottom of the cliff," she told him. "He is going to freeze to death in 12 minutes. If I go get him, I will need you at the anchor line. If I get him, and he is not a man, I am glad to see, I will still bring him up, because a person who is dying at the foot of a cliff has stopped being any particular person, has become only a person. So we do not have the luxury of choosing to know who they were before the cold got them." Ohanko was out of the pallet before she finished. He was pulling on the wool socks she had knit for him from the yarn Hattie had smuggled out of the inn's mending basket in the third week of the storm. He was tightening the belt she had made him from a strip of Osborne's tannery hide. He did not ask her what she meant by "a man I am not glad to see." He had in his short life learned the shape of that particular sentence did not require it explained. She dressed for the wind. 2 flannel shirts, the sheepskin vest she had traded Mrs. Peabody for a rewritten Bible. In the second week, the canvas coat over that, a wool muffler she had knit herself in the 5th day of the storm, because her hands had needed a task to keep them from shaking. She wrapped her boots with strips of jute sack to slow the rate at which the leather would surrender to the cold. She took the axe. She took the coil of rope from beside the anchor spike. She took the small tin lantern she had lit from a spill of the stove, hooded on 3 sides so the flame would not blow out. She took a folded blanket because a body found in a snowdrift needed to be wrapped in something before it was moved, or the wrapping would fail at the top of the cliff when the body was needed most. She looked at Ohanko one more time at the fissure. He was crouched at the standing block, hands on the rope feet, braced against the 2 spikes she had driven into the wall. "You feel 3 sharp pulls," she told him. "You start hauling. You feel 2 long, you stop and hold. You feel 1, you take up slack. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Do not come out even if I stop pulling. The rope holds either me or I let go of it, and it holds nothing. So either way, you stay at that block." Yes, yes. She went out through the fissure. The wind hit her sideways in the way wind hits a person on a ledge at night in a storm on the flank of a limestone cliff in November, which is to say, it hit her the way a horse hits a fence post. She dropped into the descent line, paid out the rope through her gloved right hand, at the speed her father had taught her to use on a scaffold, went down the 80 feet to the road in a controlled series of short arrests. So the snow at the base of the cliff was up to her thighs by the time her boots found ground. So she stood in the dark for a beat with the lantern hooded against her chest, listening. There, to the north, not far, maybe 40 yards. She moved. Each step in the drift cost her a full breath. Her breath was already unreliable. So by the time she reached the shape she had seen the outline of, she was whistling at the top of her lungs in the way that told her the tincture bottle would be needed within the hour if she was going to be any use to anyone on the ascent. The horse was already dead. Its neck was folded wrong beneath it. There was a wet, dark blot on the snow beside its head that told her the 3rd shot had done what the man had asked of it. 6 feet from the horse, half buried, was the man himself. She unhooded the lantern. She lowered it. She looked at the face. She had prepared herself on the descent for the possibility that it would be Judd Ackerley. She had not until that moment understood that she had not prepared herself for what the fact of his face at the base of her cliff would do to her chest. Something rose up in her that was not pity, was not vindication, was not the clean, cold accounting she had assumed she would perform. It was closer to grief, so grief was not a thing she had allotted room for in the ledger of the winter. She permitted herself 2 full breaths of it. Then she put it in the same box where she had put the sheepskin coat, plus the pewter thimble, plus the small, unmarked mound in the ash tree grove, so she got to work. He was in the last phase of the cold, the still one, the one her mother had called the apathetic hour. He was not shivering. He was not curled. He was on his side with his eyes half open, his breath coming in the shallow, slow rhythm of a person for whom breathing had begun to feel optional. She wrapped the blanket around him twice, pulled the corners tight under his arms, tied them at his chest with a length of rope, rolled him onto his back, cut the useless straps of his canvas coat with the pocket knife because the coat had frozen into a shell that would only slow the work. She looped the bowline under his arms. She stood up. She gave 3 sharp pulls on the standing line, felt the tension come up as Ohanko put his weight on it. At the anchor began, in the way her father had taught her. A man could beat a mountain, provided he did not try to beat it alone. To walk her side of the double line back down the road, while the mechanical advantage at the top did the work of lifting Judd Ackerley's dead weight off the drift up the face of the cliff. The system worked. It worked because Sadie Hollister had bought the block and tackle in Denver in 1873. It worked because the map on the ridge above the fissure had shown her the bollard. It worked because a boy of 12 who weighed 65 pounds had spent the last 5 days learning to trust his own weight against a rope on a stone floor. It worked at the very last because she had done the work of the previous 3 weeks, had prepared for a rescue she had not known she would be called upon to perform in the way a woman prepares for a fire she does not intend to start. It took 91 minutes. She counted them because counting kept her lungs on task. It took 2 rests because her lungs failed her twice each time she had to sit down in the snow at the base of the cliff, force air in through the mint leaves in her pocket, until the whistling narrowed to a level she could work through. It took at the very end an act of will she did not know she had in her. When the last 10 feet of the ascent required her to climb the face beside the ropes, rather than at the base of them, so that she could guide Judd's body through the fissure by hand, keep his shoulders from wedging in the throat of the passage. Ohanko was at the anchor with his weight on the rope, both hands wrapped in strips of jute against the burn of the fibers, so when she pulled Judd through the fissure and laid him on the floor of the chamber and told Ohanko to release the standing line, the boy sat back on his heels, did not speak for a full minute, because he had not, in the 11 weeks since he had left the laundry yard at Carlisle, been permitted to feel proud of any specific thing he had done. Now he was, so the feeling was a large one, to accommodate in a body of 65 pounds. Judd Ackerley in the chamber was not going to die. She confirmed that within 20 minutes. She stripped the frozen coat off him, hung it on a nail she had driven into the far wall for drying purposes, wrapped him in the second wool blanket plus the sheepskin vest she had lent Ohanko during the storm's coldest hour, rubbed his hands and feet with lard until the color returned in the order. It was supposed to got a spoon of warm tea into him, then a second, then a third. He was, however, going to lose the tip of the smallest finger on his left hand. She could see that at once. The finger had turned the wax yellow color that had a name in her mother's book, so she knew even before she pressed the pad of her thumb to it and found it hard that no amount of warming would give it back to him. He had also broken his right forearm in the fall from the horse, the ulna cleaned the radius green stick, both bones popping out of place under the swelling of the sleeve. She would set it in the morning when he was warm enough to bear the pain of the set. For tonight she splinted it against a piece of split cedar, bound it with the strips of cotton she had cut from her spare chemise, made a sling from the muffler, hung it from his neck, sat back on her heels beside the pallet where she had moved him, looked at the man who had on the porch of a house she had made livable, called their 3 years in arrangement. He came fully awake somewhere between the 4th spoonful of tea and the 5th. His eyes found the ceiling of the chamber. His eyes found the burlap shine of the jute sacks on the walls. His eyes found the wood pile, which was still, even after 12 days of storm, a wall of stacked cedar higher than his head. His eyes found the stove. His eyes found her. He tried to speak. She held up a hand. She told him in the level voice that he was not to speak yet. He was to drink tea. He was to lie still. He was when she permitted it to ask questions in the order she chose, because she was the person in the chamber who was currently doing the arithmetic on his survival, so the arithmetic required his cooperation. He nodded. She fed him tea for another 5 minutes. Then she allowed him one question. He asked in a voice that was cracked and small and shocked at itself where they were. She told him the truth. She told him he was in a chamber 60 feet up the west face of the Cathedral Spires, in a shelter that had been built in 1874 by a woman he had never heard of, and had been reprovisioned in October of 1885 by a woman he had once thrown off a porch. She told him that, if he tried to leave, he would fall and die. If he stayed, he would be alive. She told him she would tolerate him in her chamber on the specific terms she was about to describe. He listened. He did not attempt to speak. She listed the terms. He would eat what she gave him in the portion she chose. He would drink when she told him to drink. He would not, under any circumstances, address the boy in the second chamber except through her. He would not use the boy's name. He would not ask the boy any questions. He would not speak of the boy to any person in Silverbow Gulch or Cheyenne or in any other place in this territory or any other in this life or in the one that might come after this one. So if the day arrived when he could not remember the boy's face, he would count that day as the beginning of his own personal grace. If she found at any point during his convalescence that he had violated any of these terms, she would take her rope, lower him back down the cliff on a single line, without the block let go at the bottom. She said this in the same tone she had used for the arithmetic. He understood that she meant it. His face understood before his mouth did. He asked on the second day about Cordelia. She had been waiting for the question. She did not at first answer him. She let him eat his beans. She let him drink his tea. Then in the afternoon, when the light in the fissure had gone, the pale, useful gray that meant a break in the storm, she sat down opposite him at the stove, told him what he had told her in his fever the previous night, when he had been talking to a woman he thought was his mother. He had told the woman he thought was his mother that Cordelia Whitfield of Denver was not the daughter of the president of the First National Bank of Denver, because there was no woman by her name in that man's family, because she had told him a story from a script she had used twice before in Colorado, because her actual name was Nell Barrow, so she had taken 40% of his cattle by deed in the second week of November, had taken his father's pocket watch, plus his mother's cameo brooch, by simpler means. In the third, had ridden out of Silverbow Gulch on a stolen sleigh at the beginning of a blizzard with a strong box of gold pieces that would keep her fed in Denver until the passes reopened in April. Judd Ackerley, when she was done telling him what he had told her, looked at the wall of the chamber for a long time. He looked at it the way a man looks at a wall when the wall is doing the work of holding him together. Then he looked at his own bandaged hand, at the empty spot where the tip of his smallest finger would soon not be began, without warning himself first to cry. He cried the way a man cries who has not cried since childhood, which is to say, badly. In ugly small shakes he could not control, with sounds coming out of him he could not have anticipated. She let him. She did not touch him. She did not offer him a handkerchief. She sat opposite him at the stove, let him do the necessary work of the tears in the way her mother had let patients do the necessary work of the wound. When he was done, he asked her in a voice she had not heard from him in 3 years whether she could forgive him. She looked at him for a long, slow measure. Then she told him no, that forgiveness was not currently on the ledger, that the ledger was still open, that she was still doing the work of pricing what he had cost her, that any conversation about forgiveness would need to wait until she had finished the arithmetic. She told him this without heat. She told him this in the same tone she had used to describe the terms of his convalescence. She added, because she wanted him to understand what he had asked of her, the sentence that she had been carrying since the porch had not yet had occasion to say aloud, "What you took from me is not the ranch. What you took from me is the amount of my one life you asked me to spend on a floor you had already promised to somebody else. I will not spend the winter counting it because I have other work. But you will not ask me to forgive the count until I have finished it." He nodded. He did not speak again for the rest of the afternoon. Ohanko came into the main chamber that evening, set a bowl of beans by the pallet without looking at Judd. So Judd took the bowl without looking at Ohanko. Neither of them was rude to the other. Neither of them was kind. So Willa thought that a truce of this kind, achieved in silence on the second day of a stranger's presence, was as much as the chamber could support that November. On the fourth day of Judd's presence in the chamber, with the storm at last fully broken, and the wind reduced to the ordinary whine of a normal Wyoming night, she opened the ledger to a fresh blank page, set it in front of him with a pencil, dictated to him the terms of a confession she had been composing in her head since the porch. He had defrauded her by intent when he had recorded the homestead deed under his sole name in 1882. He had known she believed the two of them held the property jointly. He had permitted her to invest 3 years of labor on that belief without correcting it. He had, on the morning of October 14, 1885, evicted her from a property to which she had a valid claim in equity under the doctrine of unjust enrichment, had, in the presence of a peace officer of Laramie County, made a materially false statement regarding the ownership of a garment she had produced with her own labor, plus materials transferred to her use. He had further entered into a marriage engagement with a woman he now believed to have entered that engagement, with fraudulent intent, had, in the course of that engagement, allowed her use of ranch resources in a manner that would, in the event of the ranch being lost to fire caused by improper use of a stove installed on the property at the woman's insistence, materially reduce the assets available to satisfy his prior obligations to Wilhelmina Ashwood. He wrote it in his own hand. She corrected 2 of his sentences for clarity. Ohanko, sitting cross-legged by the stove, watched with the polite attention of a boy who was learning that adult accounting could be conducted with a pencil as well as a rope. Judd signed the confession at the bottom. She witnessed it. Ohanko, at her invitation, made a small, careful mark beside her signature that would not, she knew, hold up in any court in the territory, but that would hold up in her own private register of the world. That was for the purposes of the chamber, the register that counted. She put the ledger away in the cedar box with Sadie's diary. She sat for a while after that, looking at the fire, thinking about the way a mountain could rearrange a person's understanding of what was permanent plus what was owed. Ohanko, beside her, was carving a small piece of cedar with the pocket knife she had lent him 3 days before, shaping it with the same slow patience with which he did everything. So when she looked at what he was making, she saw that it was a small horse, no bigger than her thumb, with its head lowered, plus its mane running the length of its neck in the specific way of a Mustang running full out into a wind. He did not tell her what the horse was for. She did not ask him. He set it on the shelf above the stove when he was done, in the small space between the tin of matches plus the jar of blackberry preserves. So she understood, without needing to be told, that he had made it for the mule at the bottom of the cliff. That a boy who makes a small carved horse for a dead animal he has never seen is a boy who has been paying closer attention to the woman who took him in than the woman had known. She sat late by the stove that night. The wind had finally dropped to the ordinary breath of the mountain. The stars, when she looked out through the fissure with the canvas rolled back a hand's width, were the specific, hard, clean stars of a Wyoming sky after a long storm. She could see 90 miles east the faint, distant smudge of the lamps of Cheyenne against the horizon, so small she could have covered it with her thumbnail. She could see 3 miles west, 800 feet below her, the pale ribbon of the wagon road along it, the tiny orange dots that were the coal oil lanterns of the search parties. Sheriff Amos Redding, had she now understood from Judd's own fever, begun to lead out of Silverbow Gulch on the 7th day of the storm, looking for a man who had ridden east into a blizzard from the wreckage of his own house. She watched the little dots for a long time. She thought about the map on the ridge above her, about the 2 words Sadie had written by the marks on the ridge. So she understood with a clarity that felt like an answer to a question she had been carrying since October, that a woman who had built a lantern in a window 10 years ago had also at the same time built the door out. Watch then out. She would climb down in the morning. She would carry the confession in the inside pocket of her coat. She would bring Ohanko, because leaving him in the chamber alone would frighten him worse than facing the town, because a boy who had learned to trust a woman with his name in the middle of a storm should not have to spend the first morning of his freedom in the same room where the storm had trapped him. She would bring Judd because Judd was the exhibit, because the exhibit was going to have to walk into town on his own 2 feet in front of witnesses if the confession in her pocket was going to have any weight at the courthouse in Cheyenne. She would bring the diary in her trunk because the diary was the second half of a story a man in a marshal's coat was going to need to hear before the winter was out. She banked the fire. She checked the flue. She set the last of the water on the stove for the morning tea. She sat down on the pallet beside the sleeping boy in the second chamber. For a moment watched his face in the low glow of the coals. Thought about the way her son would have looked at his age, so she permitted herself one small stroke of his hair with the back of her knuckles. the way her mother had once stroked her own hair on the last night in Pennsylvania. Then she stood up, went back to the main chamber, blew out the lamp, lay down on her own pallet with the ledger under her head because she had come over the course of 6 weeks to prefer sleeping on the record of her own arithmetic to sleeping on any pillow the town below had ever offered her. Morning came a shade earlier than she had planned for it. She was up before the light. She fed the fire. She boiled water. She poured tea into 3 tin cups. She woke Ohanko first, then Judd, in that order of importance. She fed each of them a portion of rye porridge with a spoon of lard, one of jerked beef, one of dried apple. She checked Judd's splinted arm, retied the sling. She put the confession in an oilcloth packet inside her coat. She put the diary of Sadie Hollister in the cedar box. Then in the pack with the last note S.H. had left in the second chamber tucked inside the front cover. They went out through the fissure at 6:08 on the morning of December 1st, 1885. Willa first, then Ohanko, then Judd, whose descent required her to rig a second harness from the tack rope so that he could be lowered on the good arm while the broken one hung against his chest in the muffler sling. It took an hour to bring the 3 of them down the 80 feet to the shale road. It took another 20 minutes to walk east along the road to where the town would eventually meet them. The town met them halfway. It met them in the form of a search party of 6 mounted men, led by Sheriff Amos Redding, coming west along the wagon road on the strength of a report from a rancher who had at first light seen smoke rising thin from the west face of the Cathedral Spires, and had in the specific caution of a man who had lived 20 years in the territory ridden into Silverbow Gulch to say so. Redding saw them first. He reined in his horse so sharply that the animal shied, put a hoof through a patch of ice, nearly went over. He sat on the animal for a long beat without speaking, without dismounting, without breathing that anyone could see. Then he swung down, walked to Willa across the frozen road on legs that had known too much saddle to hurry, easily stopped 6 feet in front of her. Took his hat off with the deliberate care of a man taking off a hat at a funeral. "Wilhelmina Ashwood," he told her, in a voice that was not much of a voice. "We buried your name 3 weeks ago in the parlor of the Methodist Church." The Reverend Coles gave the eulogy. Mrs. Peabody sang. "There is a headstone in the Silverbow plot with your date on it that Ambrose Grimshaw paid for with his own money." Willa did not smile. She did not weep. She had passed the point in her life where the news of her own funeral had the power to move her in any particular direction. She looked at Redding. She spoke. "Sheriff Redding," she told him in the voice she had used the morning she set down 2 tin cups on the porch rail. "I have not yet died. I have brought you Judd Ackerley, who was reported missing on the 5th of November. I have also brought you a boy of 12 who is in my care. I have also brought you a signed confession that concerns a fraud in the recorder's office in Cheyenne, plus a second matter I believe falls under the jurisdiction of a federal marshal. If you have coffee at the inn, I would drink a cup of it before I speak to anyone else." Redding put his hat back on. He nodded once. He turned to the men behind him. He gave 3 orders in the flat, efficient voice of a man who has just been handed a piece of work that will require him to think about 6 things at once. He ordered one man to ride ahead to the Blue Jay Inn, plus tell Hattie Boone to set 5 plates. He ordered a second man to ride to the office of the town telegrapher, plus send a wire to the office of the United States Marshal for the Wyoming Territory in Cheyenne, requesting the immediate attendance of any federal officer available for a matter involving fraud plus a possible arson. He ordered a third man to dismount, plus give his horse to Judd Ackerley, plus a fourth to give his horse to the boy. Redding himself walked beside Willa the last mile into town on foot, in the specific act of penance that a lawman performs when he understands that he has already been forgiven for a thing he has not yet forgiven himself for. The town met them at the edge of Front Street. It met them in the form of every soul who was not already in a sickbed or a schoolroom, because word of the smoke on the Cathedral Spires had traveled quickly, plus because a woman thought dead does not walk into Silverbow Gulch beside a sheriff every morning of the year. Hattie Boone stood on the porch of the Blue Jay Inn with a coffee pot in one hand, plus a rifle in the other, though the rifle was not for Willa. The rifle was in case anyone in the crowd required reminding whose porch this was. Ambrose Grimshaw stood in the doorway of his mercantile with his account book against his chest like a shield. Junie Petrish stood at the corner of Willow Lane with her hands over her mouth. Mrs. Peabody stood beside her, wiping her eyes with a scrap of the same handkerchief she had used to describe the sourdough starter. Willa walked past them all, She walked to the porch of the Blue Jay Inn. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. She turned so that the crowd could see her, so that Judd Ackerley on the horse behind her could be seen beside her by every man and woman who had ever bought a beef from him or a bushel of oats from his hired hands. Then she spoke, not loudly, in the calm, level voice. "This is Judd Ackerley," she told the town. "Some of you looked for him. He was where he had chosen to be, which was riding east on the road to Denver, in a blizzard, having been robbed and abandoned by his intended wife on the night his own house burned down for lack of a properly drafted flue. I found him at the base of the Cathedral Spires on the night of the 24th of November. I brought him up into a shelter that has been on that mountain since 1874. I have kept him alive for 7 days. This morning I have brought him down to answer to Sheriff Redding, who will explain to the federal marshal when he arrives from Cheyenne the nature of the papers Judd Ackerley filed in that office in 1882 concerning the homestead I lived on until this October. I do not intend to speak further on this porch. I intend to eat breakfast. If any of you have questions, ask Sheriff Redding. If any of you have opinions, keep them until you have asked the questions." The town did not answer. The town did not need to answer. The town had, in the space of Willa's speech, been given the whole shape of a story it had spent 6 weeks telling itself sideways. So it stood in the December light in the specific silence of a room in which the last piece of a puzzle has just been placed on a table. Hattie Boone set the coffee pot down on the porch rail. She came down the steps. She wrapped her arms around Willa without saying anything, held her for the exact count of 5, stepped back, wiped her own face with her apron, said in her ordinary kitchen voice that there were eggs on the griddle, plus a bench inside, plus a boy who was going to be introduced to a plate of fatback, whether he had ever had fatback before or not. Ohanko looked at Willa. Willa nodded. Ohanko followed Hattie up the steps. Judd Ackerley on the horse sat with his good hand on the pommel, his broken arm in its sling against his chest, his face the face of a man who had been shown in one movement both the small mercy of not being dead, plus the very large public bill for having believed he was untouchable. Redding took the reins of the horse. Redding said nothing. Redding walked the horse toward the sheriff's office, one step at a time, without hurry, because the crowd was watching, because the pace of the walk was itself the first sentence of a document that was going to take 3 months to finish. Willa followed Hattie up the steps of the Blue Jay Inn. Behind her on Front Street, the town began the slow business of dispersing back into its own kitchens with the biggest piece of news it had received in a decade. Somewhere in Cheyenne, a telegraph key clicked. Somewhere along the wagon road, a mounted messenger began the 90-mile ride to the office of the United States Marshal for the Wyoming Territory. Somewhere in Denver, a woman calling herself Cordelia Whitfield was, at that exact moment, unpacking a stolen strongbox in a rented room above a lace shop on Larimer Street, unaware that the wire ahead of her had just changed the color of every road she would try to travel on for the next 6 weeks. The United States Marshal reached Silverbow Gulch on the morning of December 4th. His name was Ezekiel Hollister. He was 41 years old. He had been a marshal in the Wyoming Territory for 6 years and had before that been a deputy in Nebraska, plus a scout for the Army in the Powder River country. He wore a plain black coat over a plain gray suit, so he carried a Colt in a shoulder holster because his brother had taught him. A shoulder holster was less likely to bind in the cold than a hip rig. He had in the pocket of that coat a copy of the telegram that had reached his office in Cheyenne on the morning of December 2nd, which read, "Ackerley Matter, Silverbow Gulch. Fraud likely arson, possible interstate flight. Ashwood witness. Come. Redding." He rode in on a bay mare he had ridden out of Cheyenne 2 days before, stopped at the Blue Jay Inn, took a cup of coffee at the counter without speaking to anyone. He sat with the coffee for the length of time it took him to note the room, took the stairs to the room Hattie had set aside for him, put his saddlebag on the bed, came back down, found Sheriff Redding at the counter with a stack of papers in front of him. Redding introduced Willa, who was sitting 3 stools down with Ohanko beside her, eating a plate of eggs, with the boy learning to use a fork with the wrong hand because his right had gone stiff overnight from the anchor rope. Ezekiel Hollister looked at Willa. He nodded to her. He turned his chair so that he was facing both her and Redding at once, so he asked in a voice quiet enough that it did not travel past the counter what she had brought him. She brought him the confession first. She brought him the notation Grimshaw had made in his account book on the 18th of October, which Grimshaw had walked down to the inn the previous evening, plus laid on Hattie's counter with the words, "I believe this may be of use to somebody." She brought him the deposition Sheriff Redding had taken from her the previous afternoon, corroborating in detail the events of the 14th of October at the Ackerley homestead. She brought him Cordelia Whitfield's real name, which she had gotten from Judd in his fever, plus the description of the sleigh. Cordelia had driven out of the yard on the night of the 5th of November, plus the destination Judd had believed her to be riding toward, plus a rough estimate of the value of the goods she had taken. She brought him the fact that the parlor stove that had burned the Ackerley ranch had been installed on Cordelia Whitfield's insistence over Willa's own recorded warning, that the flue had not been tested by any chimney man out of Cheyenne, which Grimshaw could confirm because he had refused to supply Cordelia the name of one on the specific grounds that she had not asked for one until it was too late in the season to send for anyone. Ezekiel Hollister listened without taking notes. He listened without moving his hands from his coffee cup. When Willa was done with the last of it, he sat for a long, slow beat without speaking. Then he asked her one question in the same quiet voice. "You mentioned a diary," he told her. "Is there a diary I should see?" She had been waiting for the question. She had, in the 2 days since she had come down off the mountain, watched him ride into town without allowing herself to hope for the specific thing she was about to test. She reached into the pack at her feet. She lifted out the cedar box. She set the box on the counter between them, opened the lid, took out the small brown calfskin book with the leather thong around it, set the book in front of Ezekiel Hollister so that the name on the first page, when he opened it, would be the first thing he saw. He opened it. He read the name. His face did nothing for a beat. Then it did the thing a face does when a man has been holding a specific breath for 11 years and does not realize he is about to release it until it is halfway out of his chest. He put the book down flat on the counter. He put both of his hands on either side of it as if to keep it from moving. He did not look up at Willa. He did not look at Redding. He looked at the name on the page in the same way a man looks at a headstone he has been meaning to find for a long time. "Sadie," he told the counter in a voice that had gone thin at the edges. "She was my sister." Willa waited. She did not speak. There was no useful sentence she could put into the space of what had just been given to him. Ohanko on the stool beside her had put down his fork, was watching Ezekiel Hollister with the specific attention of a boy who had watched in his short life several strangers receive news that changed the shape of their standing. Ezekiel Hollister took his hands off the diary. He touched the edge of the page with one finger gently in the way a man might touch the face of a child he was not permitted to hold. He turned to the second page. He turned to the third. He read for a long, slow measure without speaking, while the coffee at his elbow went cold. He read the entries about the whip on the nail by the kitchen door. He read the entry about the finding of the fissure. He read the entry about the September of 1874 in which Sadie had written the sentence about her Zeke. He stopped there. He put his palm flat over the page. He closed his eyes for the length of a breath, opened them, kept reading. He read to the last of the entries, then to the folded note from the second chamber which Willa had tucked into the front cover the previous night specifically, so that he would find it in the order Sadie had left it. When he was done, he closed the book. He tied the leather thong. He did not for a long, slow beat look up. When he did, his eyes were dry in the specific way a man's eyes go dry when the crying is being done somewhere too deep inside for anyone else to see. "She left this for me," he told Willa. "She left this for anyone. She left it in the specific belief that whoever found it would understand what she meant when she said she had not stayed away because of me." He looked at the book. He looked at Willa. "Miss Ashwood," he told her in the voice a marshal uses when he is speaking as a marshal, but is not entirely a marshal in that moment, "I am obliged to you. I am obliged in a way that is not customary for a federal officer to declare across a counter in a public inn. I am going to arrest Judd Ackerley this afternoon on the charge of fraud in the filing of a homestead deed. I am going to ride from here to Cheyenne tomorrow morning to put a warrant on the wires for Nell Barrow, who I have some reason to believe I have crossed paths with before, under a different name, in a case out of Grand Junction. I am going to write on my own time this evening a letter to a woman who may or may not still be running a boarding house in Butte, Montana territory, whose name I have carried in the specific quiet of a man who has never given up on a thing but has learned not to speak about it. That letter is not part of the record of this office. That letter is my own affair. I mention it only because you have handed me the second half of a story I have been living in the first half of for 11 years. So it seems to me that the person who hands a man that kind of gift deserves at least the courtesy of knowing what the man intends to do with it. Willa did not speak for a beat. She looked at him. She reached across the counter, put her hand on the cover of the book, took it back into her own hand, put it back in the cedar box. Marshal Hollister, she told him, write the letter tonight. Do not mail it in the morning. Wait a week. If your letter goes in the same pouch as your warrant for Nell Barrow, it will be opened by the wrong clerk at the wrong desk in Denver. So a woman who has spent 11 years teaching herself not to answer to a name she loved will not have her privacy handed to a stranger before you have handed it to her. Wait until the warrant has done its work, then send the letter in its own envelope. Then wait for the answer with the patience of a brother, not a marshal. Ezekiel Hollister looked at her. He nodded once. He turned to Redding. He asked in his ordinary voice whether the town had a place he could set up a table, plus interview witnesses for the rest of the morning. Redding said yes. The two of them walked out of the Blue Jay Inn together into the December light toward the small pine board building on 2nd Street that served on days when it was needed, as the office of any federal officer who found himself in Silverbow Gulch with paperwork to do. They arrested Judd Ackerley at 3 in the afternoon of the same day. He did not resist. He rose from the bench in the sheriff's office, where he had spent 3 days waiting, walked without speaking to the wagon that would carry him to the county seat in Cheyenne, sat down in it with his broken arm across his chest, did not turn his head toward the crowd on Front Street. Willa did not go with him to Cheyenne. She stayed in Silverbow Gulch at the Blue Jay Inn in the small back room Hattie had cleared for her plus Ohanko. She stayed because the courthouse case would take 3 months to prepare, because Ezekiel Hollister had told her that her physical presence in Cheyenne was not required until the arraignment in March, because she had, over the course of 6 weeks in the chamber, come to prefer the specific weight of her own bed on the ground floor of Hattie's kitchen to any pillow a hotel in Cheyenne could offer her. They arrested Nell Barrow, alias Cordelia Whitfield, in Denver on the 21st of December, in a rented room above a lace shop on Larimer Street. The warrant reached Denver on the 15th. The Denver police had been watching the lace shop for 4 days before the arrest because Nell Barrow had made the specific mistake of paying her landlady in one of the $20 gold pieces from the Ackerley strongbox. So the landlady, who had been widowed the previous year by a Union Pacific brakeman who had raised her on a diet of caution about strangers who paid in gold, had walked the coin to her son-in-law, who was a Denver patrolman. Nell Barrow was extradited to the Wyoming Territory on the 29th. She was tried in Cheyenne in March. She was convicted on charges of grand larceny arson by criminal negligence plus interstate flight and sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison at Laramie. She would serve 6. Judd Ackerley's case took longer. The fraud in the filing of the homestead deed was a matter of clear record once the papers had been located in the recorder's office. The judge in Cheyenne, a man named Whipple, who had been on the bench for 11 years and had never much cared for the specific pattern of homesteaders who filed under one name while living with a woman under another, ruled in the first week of April that the deed was void ab initio for constructive fraud. That Wilhelmina Ashwood held a valid claim in equity to 50% of the value of the improved property as it had stood on the 14th of October, 1885, that the fire insurance policy Judd Ackerley had taken out on the ranch in 1884 would pay out per the terms of the policy to the recorded owner of the ranch as of the date of the fire, which was Judd Ackerley, but that the 50% equitable claim would attach to the proceeds of that policy at the moment of payment. The policy paid $4,200. Willa's share after the court took its costs, plus the attorney's fees. Ezekiel Hollister had helped her arrange with a Cheyenne lawyer named Mercer, who worked cheaply for women who had come down off mountains, came to $1,983 plus 40 cents. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. It was less than the sum of what she had been given, because the ledger of what she had been given was in the small, unmarked mound in the ash tree grove, plus in the diary of Sadie Hollister, plus in a boy of 12 who was by mid-April learning to add columns of 3-digit numbers at Hattie Boone's kitchen table with a stub of pencil in the wrong hand. Judd Ackerley was not sent to prison. Judge Whipple ruled that the fraud was civil in nature, that the arson by negligence was properly attributable to Nell Barrow's insistence on the stove installation, that the false statement Judd had made to Sheriff Redding regarding the sheepskin coat, while morally repugnant, did not rise to the level of criminal perjury because it had been made in the doorway of a house rather than on a witness stand. Judge Whipple did, however, take Judd Ackerley aside in his chambers on the last day of the case, plus explain to him in language that was on the record only in the sense that Judge Whipple had a memory that any man who ever again attempted to build a life in the Wyoming Territory under the name Ackerley would find that the letters attached to his name in every county courthouse he entered. Judd left Silverbow Gulch on the 16th of April. He did not at any point come to say goodbye to Willa. He did on the morning of his departure leave with Ambrose Grimshaw, a small package wrapped in butcher paper for delivery to her, plus a folded note. The package contained the pewter thimble she had traded to the pawn shop in October, which he had at some cost bought back from the proprietor, plus polished with his one good hand across 3 long nights in a rented room. The note read, in a hand that had learned to write with the left because the right had not yet healed straight, I have no right to ask you to forgive me. I do not ask. I return what I can. The rest is on a ledger I will carry east until I have paid it. J.A. Willa read the note. She put it in the front cover of Sadie's diary. She put the thimble on the shelf above Hattie's kitchen counter where it sat catching the morning light until she moved it in June to a shelf of her own. She did not rebuild the Ackerley Ranch. The Ackerley Ranch was a shape of ground where a house had burned, plus a life had ended, so the shape of ground was not what she had come down off the mountain to reclaim. She used $1,700 of her share of the insurance settlement to buy in early May a parcel of 520 acres at the base of the Cathedral Spires from a widower named Halloran, who was moving his family to Oregon. The parcel included a good spring, a stand of cedar, a level meadow of 40 acres that would carry cattle, plus a clear line of sight from its northern boundary to the ridge above the fissure. She hired a Cheyenne builder named Pettibone, plus his 2 sons, to raise a house on the meadow of squared timber with a stone foundation, a stone chimney lined by a mason from Denver, whose reputation had been verified by 3 separate references, a root cellar dug into the slope of the hill, big enough to hold 10 winters of preserves, a wood stove of the Rutland pattern which Willa had chosen personally at the Merchants Exposition in Cheyenne on the strength of a testing document she had read the previous February. They finished the house on the 11th of August, 1886. It had 4 rooms downstairs plus 2 rooms upstairs, plus a wide porch that faced east toward the wagon road, so that any woman who came down that road in the wrong month of the year would see the light of the porch lantern before she saw the house behind it. Ohanko chose the smaller of the upstairs rooms for himself. Willa took the larger. The 2 rooms downstairs at the front of the house she set aside as a schoolroom because she had, over the course of the winter and the spring, come to understand that the specific kind of debt she owed to Sadie Hollister was not going to be paid by a single act of shelter. She opened the school on the 15th of September, 1886. It was called in the sign Ohanko had lettered on a piece of cedar plank that Ambrose Grimshaw had planed for the purpose, the Cathedral Spires School for the Practical Education of Women and Children. It taught reading, writing, arithmetic, the naming of the local herbs from Willa's mother's book, the setting of snares, the mending of collars, the tying of knots that would hold a rope under a load, the reading of a barometer, the safe installation of a stovepipe, plus on Saturday mornings, the shooting of a Colt peacemaker at a paper target pinned to a hay bale in the meadow. It cost nothing to attend. It was open to any woman or child in the county who could reach the porch. Its first term enrolled 11 students, 7 of them women, 4 of them children, 1 of them a girl of 9 whose father had until October been a foreman on the Ackerley Ranch. The letter from Butte, Montana Territory arrived on the 22nd of September, 1886. It was addressed in a firm woman's hand in ink that was still the color of weak tea to Miss Wilhelmina Ashwood, care of the Blue Jay Inn, Silverbow Gulch, Wyoming Territory. Hattie brought it out to the school on the porch of the new house at the end of the 2nd week of the term, holding it in front of her the way a woman carries a thing that has weight in it that has nothing to do with the weight of the paper. Willa read the letter on the porch in the last light of a September afternoon with Ohanko at her side, plus Hattie at her back. The letter was 3 pages. It was signed at the bottom Sadie Hollister Kittredge, in the same hand as the name on the front page of the diary, unchanged by 11 years, except for a small tremor in the loop of the S that Willa attributed in her own private accounting to the specific weight of writing that name aloud after so long a silence. Sadie was 55. She had since 1876 kept a boarding house on Main Street in Butte, Montana territory, in which she rented 6 rooms to the widows and daughters of miners who had gone underground and not come back. She had in 1879 married a mining engineer named Amos Kittredge, who had proposed to her over a plate of beans in the boarding house kitchen and who had in every year since done the specific work of loving a woman who had built her own house from her own hands before she had ever met him. She had 2 sons. The older, named for her grandfather, was 9. The younger, named for her brother, was 6. She had received on the 14th of September a letter from her brother Ezekiel that had contained inside it a smaller sealed envelope in the hand of a woman named Willa Ashwood, whom she did not know, but whom her brother had described as the finder of a book Sadie had left in a mountain in the Wyoming Territory in the September of 1875. She had read Wilhelmina's letter. She had read her brother's letter. She had sat for a long, slow measure at her kitchen table without speaking. She had, when her husband came in from the yard, told him for the first time in 7 years the whole shape of what she had never quite explained about the country she had come from. She had on the following morning written to Wilhelmina, "Miss Ashwood," the letter read in its second paragraph, "I do not know you. I have not seen the country of the Cathedral Spires in 11 years. I do not know if I will see it again in this life. What I know is that a woman who has read the last page of a book I left, plus who has understood it enough to bring my brother the book instead of the story of it, is a woman I am obliged to for a specific reason. I did not know when I left the mountain whether anyone would find what I built there. I hoped. I did not permit myself to hope too loudly. I hoped in the specific quiet of a woman who had learned at the cost of a life that a lantern in a window is only a lantern if a stranger walks into its light of her own accord. You have walked into its light. You have kept the light burning by your own account. You have added, from what my brother tells me, a room to the house I built without permission, plus without apology, which is the only way a house of that kind is ever added to. I ask you a favor. It is the only favor I have ever asked of a stranger, and it will be the last. I ask that you keep the diary. I do not want it. I have made my peace with the woman who wrote it by leaving her on the mountain where I left her. I want instead for the diary to sit on a shelf in a house you have built with your own hands, in a room where the light falls on it in the morning, in the specific expectation that the next woman who needs to read it will find it there. If you will do this, I will consider us as friends who have never met. Plus, I will send you in a separate parcel this winter a small package which contains the second key to a box in the fissure that you may not yet have found. It sits behind a loose stone in the north wall of the second chamber at the height of a woman's shoulder. In the box are 3 maps I did not have time to leave in the first, which show 2 shelters I built in the Bighorn country, plus 1 in the timber above the Sweetwater. I built them for the same reason I built the one in the Spires. I built them because I did not know at the time how many of us there would need to be. I do not know now. I only know that the number is not 1. Willa finished the letter. She folded it. She put it inside the front cover of Sadie's diary, beside the note from the second chamber and the note from Judd. She sat on the porch of the new house for a long, slow measure, watching the light on the ridge above the fissure, thinking about a box in the north wall of the second chamber, plus about 3 shelters in 3 ranges of country she had not yet seen, plus about the specific arithmetic of the number that was not 1. The following morning, she plus Ohanko rode out along the wagon road toward the base of the Cathedral Spires. They rode a pair of horses she had bought from Halloran with the house, a chestnut named Meridian plus a bay named Sunday. They tied the horses at the cedar root. They climbed the switchbacks she had cut into the cliff face during the second week of March when the melt had made a good path possible. They came in through the fissure at 10 in the morning of the 23rd of September. 1886, 1 year and 1 week after the morning, Judd Ackerley had stood on a porch with a woman in kid gloves and used the word arrangement. The chamber was cold. The stove was cold. The pallet was neatly folded against the far wall exactly as Willa had left it on the morning of the 1st of December. The woodpile was intact. The buckets against the far wall were empty, the water having evaporated over the course of the summer. The jute sacks on the walls had bleached slightly in the small light that came down the flue. She went to the second chamber first. She lit the lamp. She measured the north wall at the height of her own shoulder. She found the loose stone in the 3rd row. She pulled it out. She reached into the space behind it. She brought out a small tin box the size of a hand mirror wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had not yet gone brittle. She opened the box. Inside were 3 folded maps in Sadie's brown ink. There was also at the bottom of the box a second key on a leather thong plus a small folded scrap of paper on which Sadie had written in the same firm hand as the first note in the first box. The key opens a door in a shed at the third X on the third map. The door is at the back of the shed. Do not go alone. Willa closed the box. She looked at Ohanko. Ohanko looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a beat. Then she went back to the main chamber. She set the diary of Sadie Hollister on the natural stone shelf above the stove in the small space between the tin of matches, plus the jar of blackberry preserves, plus beside the small carved cedar horse Ohanko had made the previous December. She set beside the diary the letter from Butte, folded inside the same oilcloth packet. She set beside the letter the tin box with the 3 maps plus the second key. She stood in the chamber for a long, slow measure. Then she said aloud in the calm, level voice the sentence she had been carrying in her chest since the letter had arrived on the porch. The number is not 1. It has never been 1. It will not be 1 after me. The stove was cold. The wind in the fissure was quiet. The chamber received the sentence in the specific silence of a room that had already known it for 11 years and had been waiting only for a second voice to speak it into the air. They left the chamber before noon. Willa closed the fissure behind her with a new plank door she had brought up in 3 pieces the previous week and hung on iron hinges she had forged in Grimshaw's back shop. The door had a lock. She did not set the lock. She hung the key on a wooden peg on the outside of the door at the height of a woman's shoulder beside a small brass plate on which she had the evening before. Punched with a nail set the single line of text she wanted any traveler to read who came to that fissure in the wrong month of the year. This door is not locked. Take what you need. Leave a note if you have time. They rode down off the mountain in the last of the September sun. The wagon road east towards Silverbow Gulch was the color of pale straw. The cathedral spires behind them threw a long, slow shadow across the meadow of the new place, so the porch of the new house in the low light showed a single burning lantern that Hattie had lit at 4 o'clock as she did every afternoon of every day of the fall of 1886, whether or not she was expecting anyone in particular to come home along that road. Sometimes when the autumn winds began to sharpen and the first heavy flakes of a coming season began to fall from the wide gray sky of the Wyoming Territory, Willa would ride out from her porch time meridian at the cedar root climb, the switchbacks alone. She would stand at the plank door of the fissure with her hand on the brass plate, breathing the specific cold of a country that had, without ever intending it, turned her from a woman who had been thrown off a porch into a woman who kept a light in a window at the base of a limestone cliff for anyone who might on some other October morning need to see it. She would not on those visits open the door. She would only touch the plate. She would only listen for a beat to the mountain, to the wind in the fissure, to the specific hush of stone that had for 11 years plus counting kept its promises. Then she would ride back down to the porch where Ohanko would be waiting on the step with a book in his hand where Hattie's lantern would be already lit against the coming dark, where a small pewter thimble sat on a windowsill catching the last of the daylight, where the school bell she had bought that summer at a farm auction outside Laramie sat on its post beside the front gate, ready to be rung for whatever child came up the road in the morning. The mountain had not saved her. She had saved herself. The mountain had only been the room in which she had at last discovered the woman she had always been. What she had built afterward on the meadow at its base was the sentence she had chosen to write with the rest of her life, in the specific expectation that some other woman on some other cold morning would read it and understand.